Hey y'all. Sorry for getting started a little late today. I wish I had a really good reason, but I just straight up lost track of time. Y'all know how it is. Okay, so today, in addition to continuing our long-standing read of House on the Borderland, we're going to take another look at, or rather, a look at another John Charles Dent short story. After the second one, I honestly have no idea what to expect. The first one was a buck wild ass mystery, and the second one was a real downer. Hey, Evelyn. Um, so I don't know. This one's called The Haunted House on Duchess Street, so I guess it's gonna be a spooky story, maybe some kind of goose to ghost story, maybe. I don't know, y'all. All bets are off. Honestly, we'll just have to see. Okay, well, I don't see any reason to delay any further. Let's see where this one goes. Actually, is my mic? Hold on, let me adjust this a little bit. It's a little low. Here we go. That's much better. All right, the I assume that's a typo on the trans transliteration to the Gutenberg library, but the haunted house on Duchess Street, being a narration of certain strange events alleged to have taken place at York, Upper Canada, in or about the year 1823. O'er all there hung the shadow of a fear, a sense of mystery the spirit daunted, and said as plain as whisper in the ear, the place is haunted. I feel like that one should have been read by Vincent Van Gogh from the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. That's just how that one feels. Maybe this one will be silly. It'll be a nice change of pace. So, part one, Outside the House. I suppose there are at least a score of persons living in Toronto at the present moment who remember that queer old house on Duchess Street. Not that there was anything specially remarkable about the house itself, which indeed in its best days presented an aspect of rather snug respectability. But the events I am about to relate invested it with an evil reputation, and made it an object to be contemplated at a safe distance, rather than from any near approach. Youngsters on their way to school were wont to eye it askance as they hurried by on their way to their daily tasks. Even children of a larger growth manifested no unbecoming desire to penetrate too curiously into its inner mysteries, and for years its threshold was seldom or never crossed by anybody except Simon Washburn or some of his clerks, who about once every 12 months made a quiet entry upon the premises and placed in the front windows announcements to the effect that the place was for sale or to let. Oh, is that a thing? I see. The printing of these announcements involved a useless expenditure of capital, for, from the time when the character of the house became matter of notoriety, no one could have induced to try the experiment of living in it. In the case of a house, no less than in that of an individual, a bad name is more easily gained than lost, and in the case of the house on Duchess Street, its uncanny repute clung to it with a persistent grasp which time did nothing to relax. It was distinctly and emphatically a place to keep away from. The house was originally built by one of the Ridout family, I think by the Surveyor General himself, soon after the close of the War of 1812, and it remained intact until a year or two after the town of York became the city of Toronto. When it was partially destroyed, or partly destroyed, and converted into a more profitable investment. The new structure, which was a shingle or stave factory, was burned down in 1843 or 1844, and the site thenceforth remained unoccupied until comparatively recent times. Then I visited the spot a few weeks, since I encountered not a little difficulty in fixating upon the exact site, which is covered by an unprepossessing row of dark red brick, presenting the aspect of having stood there from time immemorial, though, as I am informed, the houses have been erected within the last quarter of a century. Unattractive as they appear, however, they are the least uninviting feature of the landscape, which is prosaic and squalid beyond description. Rickety, tumble-down tenements of dilapidated lath and plaster stare at the beholder in the face at every turn. During the greater part of the day, the solitude of the neighborhood remains unbroken, save by the tread of some chance wayfarer like myself, and a general atmosphere of the abomination of desolation reigns supreme. Passing along the unfrequented pavement, one finds it difficult to realize the fact that this was once a not unfashionable quarter of the capital of Upper Canada. The old house stood 40 or 50 feet back from the roadway on the north side, overlooking the waters of the bay. The lot was divided from the street by a low picket fence, and admission to the enclosure was gained by means of a small gate. In those remote times, there were few buildings intervening between the Duchess Street and the waterfront, and those few were not very pretentious, so that when the atmosphere was free of fog, you could trace from the windows of the upper story the entire hithermost shore of the peninsula, which has since become the island. The structure itself, like most buildings then erected in York, was of frame. Oh, it was built frame, right, frame houses. For some reason, that sentence baffled me. It was of considerable dimension for those days, and must have contained at least 8 or 9 rooms. It was 2 stories high, and had a good deal of painted fretwork around the windows of the upper story. A stately elm stood immediately in the rear, and its wide spreading branches overshadowed the greater part of the backyard and outbuildings. And that is all I have been able to learn about the exterior aspect of the place. I'm always, since that first story, I'm always a bit on guard about all of these details, where all of them were at some point important, so I have no idea whether any of this is set dressing or not. Part 2, Inside the House. This is all just description. We're painting a little picture of this creepy haunted house. A small porch door about halfway down the western side furnished the ordinary mode of entrance to and exit from the house. That's how things go, yes. This door opened into an apartment which served the double purpose of sitting room and dining room, and which was connected by an inner door with the kitchen and back premises. There was, however, a rather wide-mouthed front entrance, approached by a small flight of wooden steps, and opening into a fair-sized hall. To the right of the hall, as you entered, a door opened into what served as a drawing room, which was seldom used, as the occupants of the house were not given to receiving much fashionable company. To the left of the hall, another door opened into the dining room already mentioned. A stairway facing the front entrance conducted you to the upper story, which consisted of several bedrooms and a large apartment in front. This latter must have been, by long odds, the pleasantest room in the house. It was of comfortable dimensions, well lighted, and cheerful as to its outlook. 2 front windows commanded a prospect of the bay and the peninsula, while a third window on the eastern side overlooked the valley of the Don, which was by no means the stagnant pool which it was destined to become in later years. The only entrance to this chamber was a door placed directly to the right hand of the head of the stairway, which stairway, it may be mentioned, consisted of exactly 17 steps. I hope you're writing this down. A small bedroom in the rear was accessible only by a separate door at the back of the upper hallway, and was thus not directly connected with the larger apartment. I am not informed as to the precise number and features of the other rooms in the upper story, except that it is that they were bedrooms, nor is any further information respecting them essential to a full comprehension of the narrative. Why I have been so precise as to what may at first appear trivial details will hereafter appear. Oh, ho, ho. Well, we've been promised a full account of the necessity of all of these details, I'm sure. Yes, and part 3, the tenants of the house. As already mentioned, the house was probably built by Surveyor General Ridout, but it does not appear that either he or any member of his family ever resided there. The earliest occupant of whom I have been able to find any trace was Thomas Mercer Jones. That name looks familiar. The gentleman, I presume, who was afterwards connected with the Canada Land Company. Whether he was the first tenant, I am unable to say, but a gentleman bearing that name dwelt there during the latter part of the year 1816, and appears to have been a well-known citizen of Little York. In 1819, the tenant was a person named McKechnie? Yeah, McKechnie, excuse me. As to whom I have been unable to glean any information whatever beyond the bare fact that he was a pew holder in St. James Church. He appears to have given place to one of the numerous members of the Powell family. I'm sure if you're brushed up on your Terratonian history, this is all very interesting. Possibly. Again, I don't know my Canadian history, so I assume that it was still a colony by this point. But the occupant with whom this narrative is more immediately concerned was a certain ex-military man named Bywater. Oh, that's a good name. Who woke up to the echoes of York society for a few brief months between 60 and 70 years ago, and who, after passing a lurid interval of his misspent life in this community, solved the great problem of human existence by falling downstairs and breaking his neck. Hold on, I really need to just read that whole sentence altogether because that actually is very beautiful. That was all one. Yes, but the occupant with whom this narrative is more immediately concerned was a certain ex-military man named Bywater, who woke up the echoes of York society for a few brief months between 60 and 70 years ago, and who, after passing a lurid interval of his misspent life in this community, solved the great problem of human existence by falling downstairs and breaking his neck. You know, I poke a lot of fun at John Charles Dent for his prose, but damn, when he hits it, it's really, really satisfying. That was good. That's a good line. You could just put that bitch right on the back of his book. I need a drink after that. Goodness. Captain Stephen Bywater was a mauvais sujet, I think I know that phrase, offhand, of the most pronounced stamp. Oh, are we getting judgy? Oh, baby! He came of a good family in one of the Midland counties of England, entered the army at an early age, and was present on a certain memorable Sunday at Waterloo, on which occasion he is said to have borne himself gallantly and well. But he appears to have had a deep vein of ingrained vice in his composition, which perpetually impelled him on to crooked paths. Various ugly stories were current about him, for all of which there was doubtless more or less foundation. It was said that he had been caught cheating at play, and that he was an adept in all the rascalities of the turf. I desperately want to know what the rascalities of the turf means. I'm gonna put a little bookmark on that one. The deplorable event which led to the resignation of his commission made considerable noise at the time of its occurrence. A young brother officer, whom he had swindled out of large sums of money, was forced by him into a duel which was fought on the French coast in the presence of 2 seconds and a military surgeon. There seems to have been no doubt that the villainous captain fired too soon. At any rate, the youth who had been inveigled into staking his life on the issue was left dead on the field, while the aggressor rode off unscathed, followed by the excoriations of his own second. A rigid inquiry was instituted, but the principal witnesses were not forthcoming, and the murderer, for such as he was commonly regarded, escaped the punishment which everybody considered he had justly merited. The severance of his connection with the army was a foregone conclusion, and he was formally expelled from his club. He was socially sent to Coventry, and his native land soon became for him a most undesirable place of abode. Then he crossed the Atlantic and made his way to Upper Canada, where, after a while, he turned up at York and became a tenant in the house on Duchess Street. At the time of his arrival in this country, which must have been sometime in 1822 or perhaps early in 1823, Captain Bywater was apparently about 40 years of age. He was a bachelor and possessed of some means. For a very brief period, he contrived to make his way into the select society of the provincial capital, but it soon became known that he was the aristocratic desperado who had so ruthlessly shot down young Remy Errington on the sands near Boulogne. I know that's not Bologna. I do not know how to say that word in French, but I'm just going to say Bologna. And who had the reputation of being one of the most unmitigated scamps who ever wore uniform. God, if only I could have that reputation. York society in those days could swallow a good deal in a man of good birth and competent fortune, but it could not swallow even a well-to-do bachelor of a good family and marriageable age who had been forced to resign his commission and had been expelled from a not-too-straight-laced London club by a unanimous vote of the committee. It's the most scandalous. Captain Bywater was dropped with a suddenness and severity which he could not fail to understand. He received no more invitations from mothers with marriageable daughters, and when he presented himself at their doors informally and forbidden, he found nobody at home. Ladies ceased to recognize him on the street, and gentlemen received his bows with a response so frigid that he readily comprehended the state of affairs. He perceived that his day of grace was past, and accepted his fate with a supercilious shrug of his broad shoulders. That's okay, Mooney. We'll just have no idea who he's talking about when he talks about these important personages. All we need to know is that Captain Bywater was a scoundrel and a scamp and a ne'er-do-well. But the captain was a gregarious animal, to whom solitude was insupportable. Society of some sort was a necessity of his existence, and as the company of ladies and gentlemen was no longer open to him, he sought consolation among persons of a lower grade in the social scale. He began to frequent bar-rooms and other places of public resort, and as he was free with his money, he had no difficulty in finding companions of a certain sort who were ready and willing enough to drink at his expense, and to listen to the braggadocio tales of the doughty deeds he achieved by him during his campaign in the peninsula. In a few weeks, he found himself the acknowledged head and front of a little coterie which assembled nightly at the George Inn on King Street. This, however, did not last long, as the late potations and ribald carousings of the company disturbed the entire neighborhood and attracted attention to the place. The landlord received a stern admonition to keep earlier hours and less uproarious guests. When Boniface sought to carry this admonition into effect, Captain Bywater mounted his high horse and adjourned to his own place, taking his 5 or 6 boon companions with him. From that time forward, the house on Duchess Street was the regular place of meeting. We're just gonna... Yeah, that's really good. We're just gonna hover on this title for a second. I'm gonna take a little sip of water. Oh, we getting in it. He literally said, I'll make my own bar with blackjack and hookers. Captain Bywater, upon his first arrival at York, had taken up his quarters at a public house. The York inns of the period had an unenviable reputation, and were widely different from the Queen's and Rosin of the present day. Some of my readers will doubtless remember John Gates' savage fling at them several years later. To parody Dr. Johnson's characterization of the famous leg of mutton, they were ill-looking, ill-smelling, ill-provided, and ill-kept. In a word, they were unendurable places of sojourn for a man of fastidious tastes and sensitive nerves. Perhaps the captain's tastes were fastidious, though I can hardly believe his nerves were sensitive. Possibly he wished to furnish clear evidence that he was no mere sojourner in a strange land, but that he had come here with a view to permanent settlement. At all events, his stay at an inn was of brief duration. He rented the house on Duchess Street and furnished it in a style which for those days might be called expensive, more especially for a bachelor's establishment. Tastes. The greater part of the furniture was sent up from Montreal, and the captain proclaimed his intentions of giving a grand housewarming at an early date. He had hardly become settled in the place, however, before his character and antecedent life became known, as already mentioned, and the project was abandoned. His household consisted of a manservant named Jim Summers, who he had picked up at Montreal, and the wife of the latter, who enjoyed the reputation of being an excellent cook, in which capacity she was afterwards employed at the government house during the regime of Sir John Colborne. At first, this couple had a tolerably easy time of it. The captain was not an exigeant and allowed them to run the establishment pretty much as they chose. He always rose late and went out immediately after breakfast, accompanied by his large Newfoundland dog Nero, the only living possession he had brought with him from beyond the sea. Master and dog were seen no more until dinner time, which was 5 o'clock. Between 7 and 8 in the evening, the pair would betake themselves to the George, where the captain... where the captain drank and howled himself hoarse until long past midnight. But he was a seasoned vessel, and generally had a pretty fair control over his limbs. He could always find his way home without assistance, and used to direct his man not to wait up for him. The dog was his companion whenever he stirred out of doors. But when the venue was changed from the tap room of the George Inn to the captain's own house, the troubles of Jim Summers and his wife began. The guests commonly arrived within a few minutes of each other, and were all in their places by 8 o'clock. They met in the large upper room, and their sessions were prolonged far into the night, or rather into the morning, for it happened often enough that daylight peeped in through the eastern window and found the company still undispersed. Ribald jests, drunken laughter, and obscene songs were kept up the whole night through. The quantity of rum, whiskey, brandy, and beer consumed in the course of a week must have been something to wonder at. The refreshments were provided at the expense of the host, and as it was Jim's business to keep up the supply of spirits, lemons, and hot water, he had no sinecure on his hands. It might as well be supposed that he might, if so minded, have found a more congenial situation, but as a matter of fact, he was not so over-scrupulous as to the nature of his employment, and probably had his full share of fun. The captain paid good wages, and was lavish in gratitudes when he was in good humor. On the whole, Jim considered that he had not such a bad place of it, and was by no means disposed to quarrel with his bread and butter. His wife took a different view of affairs, and ere long refused to remain on the premises during the nightly orgies. This difficulty was got over by an arrangement whereby she was permitted to quit the house at 8 o'clock in the evening, returning on the following morning in time to prepare the captain's breakfast. She spent her nights with a married sister who lived a short distance away, and by this means she avoided what to any woman of respectability must have been an unbearable affliction. The orgies, in process of time, became a reproach to the neighborhood and a scandal to the town. They were, however, kept up with few interruptions for several months. More than one townsman declared that so intolerable a nuisance must be abated, but no one liked to be the first to stir in such an unpleasant business, and the bacchanations continued to vex with mirth the drowsy ear of night, unchecked by more cleanly living citizens. But just about the time when those carousings had become absolutely intolerable to the community, they were put a stop to without any outside interference. So not orgies in the way that we are thinking, of course. I thought as much, but, the nightly orgies. So, part 5, The Catastrophe in the House. On a certain Sunday night, which was destined to be memorable in the annals of the Duchess Street house, the number of Captain Bywater's guests was smaller than usual. They consisted of only 3 persons. Henry John Porter, an articled clerk in the office of Simon Washburn. Mr. Washburn was a well-known lawyer of those times, whose office was on the corner of Duke and George Streets. He acted professionally for the Ridout family and had the letting and sale of the Duchess Street property. It was probably through this circumstance that his clerk had become acquainted with Captain Bywater. Number 2, James McDougall, who was employed in some subordinate capacity in the civil services. I can't not read annals, it's annals. I'm sorry, I have a problem. Number 3, Alfred Jordan Pilkey, whose occupation seems to have been nothing in particular. What had become of the other regular attendants does not appear. Not only were the guests few in number on this particular evening, but the proceedings themselves seemed to have been of a much less noisy character than ordinary. It was noticed that the host was somewhat out of humor, and that he displayed signs of ill temper, which were not unusual with him. His demeanor reflected itself upon his company, and the fun was neither fast nor furious. In fact, the time passed somewhat drearily, and the sedrunt broke up at the unprecedentedly early hour of 11 o'clock. The manservant saw the company out, locked the door, and repaired to the room upstairs where his master still lingered, to see if anything more was required of him. The captain sat in a large armchair by the fire, sipping a final glass of grog. He seemed gloomy and dispirited, as though he had something on his mind. In response to Jim's inquiry whether he wanted anything, he growled out, "No, go to bed and be hanged to you." Jim took him at his word, so far as the first clause of the injunction was concerned. He went to bed in his room on the opposite side of the hallway. In passing through the hall, he perceived Nero lying asleep on the mat in front of his master's bedroom, which was the small room to the rear of the large apartment where the meetings were held. Jim had not been in bed many minutes and was in a tranquil state between sleeping and waking when he heard his master emerge from the front room and pass along the hallway as though about to enter his bedchamber. Another moment, and he was roused from his somnolent, I know how to say that word, damn it, somnolent condition by the hearing of a sharp report of a pistol shot, followed by a sound from Nero, something between a moan and a howl. He sprang to the floor, but ere he could make his way into the hall, he was well nigh stunned by hearing a tremendous crash, as though some large body had been hurled violently down the stairs from top to bottom. A vague thought of robbers flashed through his brain, and he paused for a moment, as he himself afterwards admitted, half paralyzed with fright. He called aloud upon his master, and then upon the dog, but received no response from either. The crash of the falling body was succeeded by an absolute silence. Pulling his nerves together, he struck a match, lighted his candle, and passed in fear and trembling into the hallway. The first sight that greeted his eyes was the seemingly lifeless body of Nero lying stretched out at the head of the stairs. Upon approaching the body, he found blood trickling from a wound in the poor brute's throat. One of the captain's pistols lay on the floor close by. But where was the captain himself? Shading his eyes and holding the candle before him, he peered fearfully down the stairway, but the darkness was too profound to admit his seeing to the bottom. By this time, a foreshadowing of the truth had made its way to his understanding. He crept gingerly down the stairs, slowly, step by step, holding the candle far in advance, and anon calling upon his master by name. He had passed more than half the way down before he received full confirmation of his forebodings. Yeah, I rip Nero. So what, 8? 8.5 steps? There, lying at full length across the hallway, between the foot of the stairs and the front door, was the body of Remy Arrington's murderer, with the sinister, evil face turned up to the ceiling. His left arm, still grasping a candlestick, was doubled under him, and his body, in its impetuous descent, had torn away the lower portion of the balustrade. The distraught serving man raised the head onto his arm, and by such means as occurred to him, sought to ascertain whether any life still lingered there. He could find no pulsation at the wrist, but upon applying his ear to the left side, he fancied he could detect a slight fluttering of the heart. Then he rushed to the kitchen and returned with a pitcher of water, which he dashed in the prostrate face. As this produced no apparent effects, he ran back upstairs to his bedroom, threw on part of his clothes, and made his way at full speed to the house of Dr. Pritchard on Newgate Street. The doctor was a late bird and had not retired to rest. He at once set out for Duchess Street. Jim Summers going round the house of his sister-in-law on Palace Street to arouse his wife, who slept there. Upon receiving his wife's promise to follow him as soon as she could huddle on her own clothing, Jim ran on in advance and reached the Duchess Street house only a minute or two later than Dr. Pritchard. The doctor had been there long enough, however, to ascertain that the captain's neck was broken and that he was where no human aid could reach him. He would preside over no more orgies in the large room on the upper story. So, part 6, the inquest in the house. There was an inquest. That, under the circumstances, was a matter of course, but nothing of importance was elicited beyond what has already been noted. Porter, McDougal, and Pilkey all attended and gave evidence to the fact that Captain Bywater was tolerably drunk when they left him at 11, but that he was upon the whole the most sober of the party and appeared quite capable of taking care of himself. They had noticed his uncongenial mood, but could afford no conjecture as to the cause. It was impossible to suspect anything in the shape of foul play. The obvious conclusion to be arrived at was that the captain's long drinking bouts had produced their legitimate result, and that at the moment when he met his death he was suffering from, or on the verge of, delirium tremens. He generally carried a loaded pistol in his breast pocket. He had found the dog asleep on the mat before his bedchamber. It was probably asleep, or at all events, it did not hasten to get out of his way, and in a moment of insane fury or drunken stupidity, he had drawn forth his weapon and shot the poor brute dead. He had just then been standing near the top of the stairs. The quantity of liquor he had drunk was sufficient to justify the conclusion that he was not as steady on his pins as a sober man would have been. He had overbalanced himself, and that was the whole story. The coroner's jury brought in a verdict in accordance with the facts, and the captain's body was put to bed with the sexton's spade. A will, drawn up in due form in the office of Mr. Washburn, and properly signed and attested, had been made by the deceased a short time after taking possession of the place on Duchess Street. His fortune chiefly consisted of an income of £500 sterling per annum, secured on a real estate situated in Gloucestershire, England. This income lapsed upon his death, and had thus been unnecessary to make any testamentary provision respecting it, except as to the portion which should accrue between the last quarter day and the death of the testator. This portion was bequeathed to an elder brother residing in Gloucestershire. All the other property of the deceased was bequeathed to Mr. Washburn in trust to dispose of such personal belongings as did not consist of ready money, and to transmit the proceeds together with all cash in hand to said elder brother in Gloucestershire. Is it Gloucestershire? Where's Gizmo when we need him? Gloucestershire. Thank you. I would have never guessed that one on my own. The latter provisions were duly carried into effect by Mr. Washburn within a few days after the funeral, and it might well have been supposed that the good people of York had heard the last of Captain Bywater and his affairs. But they hadn't. Oh. Part 7, The Black Dog and His Master. At the sale of Captain Bywater's effects, a portion of the furniture belonging to the dining room, kitchen, and one bedroom were purchased by Jim Summers, who, with his wife, continued to reside in the Duchess Street house pending the letting of it to a new tenant. These temporary occupants thus lived in 3 rooms, their sleeping apartment being on the upper story at the northern side of the house, and on the opposite side of the hall from the large room which has been the scene of so much recent dissipation. All the rest of the house was left bare, and the doors of the unoccupied rooms were kept locked. Summers found employment as porter and assistant in Hamill's grocery store, but his wife was always on hand to show the premises to any who might wish to see them. All went on quietly until nearly a month after the funeral. Mrs. Summers had an easy time of it, as no intending tenants presented themselves, and her only visitor was her married sister, who occasionally dropped in for an hour's chat. Jim was always at home by 7 in the evening, and the time glided by without anything occurring to disturb the smooth current of their lives. But this state of things was not to be of long continuance. One night, when Mr. Washburn was busy over his briefs in his study at home, he was disturbed by a loud knocking at his front door. As it was nearly midnight, and as everyone else in the house had retired to rest, he answered the summons in person. Upon unfastening the door, he found Jim and his wife at the threshold. They were only half-dressed, and their countenances were colorless as palladium ores. They stumbled impetuously into the hall, and were evidently laboring under some tremendous excitement. The lawyer conducted them into the study, where they poured into his astonished ears a most singular tale. Their story was to the effect that they had been disturbed for several nights previously by strange and inexplicable noises in the house occupied by them on Duchess Street. They had been aroused from sleep at indeterminate hours by the sound of gliding footsteps just outside of the door of their bedroom. Once they had distinctly heard the sound of voices, which seemed to come from the large front room across the hall. As the door of that room was last closed and locked, I assume that might be a typo, was fast closed and locked, they had not been able to distinguish the particular words, but they both declared that the voice was marvelously like that of Captain Bywater. They were persons of fairly steady nerves, but their situation, all things considered, was solitary and peculiar, and they had not by any means relished these unaccountable manifestations. On each occasion, however, they had controlled themselves sufficiently to institute a vigorous investigation of the premises, but had discovered nothing to throw any light upon the subject. They had found all the doors and windows securely fastened, and there was no sign of the presence of anything or anybody to account for these gliding footsteps. They had unlocked and entered the front room and found it bare and deserted as it had been left ever since the removal of the furniture after the sale. They had even gone to the length of unlocking and entering every other room in the house, but they had found no clue to the mysterious sounds which had disturbed them. Then they had argued themselves into the belief that imagination had imposed upon them, or that there was some natural but undiscovered cause for what had occurred. They were reluctant to make themselves the laughingstock of the town by letting the idea get abroad that they were afraid of ghosts, and they determined to hold their tongues. But the manifestations had at last assumed a complexion which rendered it impossible to pursue such a course any longer, and they vehemently protested that they would not pass another night in the accursed house for any bribe that could be offered them. They had spent the preceding evening at home, as usual, and had gone to bed a little before 10 o'clock. The recent manifestation had probably left some lingering trace upon their nerves, but they had no premonitions of further experiences of the same character, and had soon dropped asleep. They knew not how long they had slept, when they were suddenly and simultaneously rendered broad awake by a succession of sounds which could not possibly be explained by any reference to mere imagination. They had heard the voice of their late master as distinctly as they had ever heard it during his life. As before, it emanated from the front room, but this time there was no possibility of their being deceived, as they caught not only the sound of his voice, but also certain words which they had often heard from his lips in bygone times. "Don't spare the liquor, gentlemen," roared the captain. "There's plenty more where that came from. More sugar and lemon, you scoundrel, and be handy there with the cup of water." I don't know why he's a pirate, but he's a pirate. I know he's English. There was heard the jingling of glasses and loud rapping as if made with the knuckles of hand upon the table. Other voices were now heard joining in the conversation, but too indistinctly for the now thoroughly frightened listeners to catch any of the actual words. There could, however, be no mistake. Captain Bywater had certainly come back from the land of shadows and reinstituted the old orgies in the old spot. Yeah, maybe it's because he's a ghost. I just assume he's a pirate. The uproar lasted for at least 5 minutes when the captain gave one of his characteristic drunken howls, and of a sudden, all was still and silent as the grave. As might have naturally been expected, the listeners were terror-stricken. For a few moments after the cessation of the disturbance, they lay there in silent, open-mouthed wonderment and fear. Then, before they could find their voices, their ears were assailed by a loud noise in the hall below, followed by the muffled bow-wow of a dog, the sound of which seemed to come from the landing at the head of the stairway. Jim could stand the pressure of the situation no longer. He sprang from the bed, lighted a candle, and rushed out into the hall. This he did, as he afterwards admitted, not because he felt brave, but because he was too terrified to remain in bed, and seemed to be impelled by a resolve to face the worst that fate might have in store for him. Just as he passed from the door into the hall, a heavy footstep was heard slowly ascending the stairs. He paused where he stood, candle in hand. The steps came on, with measured tread. A moment more, and he caught sight of the ascending figure. Horror of horrors! It was his late master, clothes, cane, and all, just as he had been in life, and at the head of the stairs stood Nero, who gave vent to another low bark of recognition. When the captain reached the landing place, he turned halfway round, and the light of the candle fell full on his face. Jim saw the whole outline with the utmost clearness, even to the expression in the eyes, which was neither gay nor sad, but rather stolid and stern, just what he had been accustomed to see there. The dog crouched back against the wall, and after a brief halt near the stairhead, Captain Bywater turned the knob of his bedroom door and passed in. The dog followed, the door was closed, and once more all was silent. Jim turned and encountered the white face of his wife. She had been standing behind him all the while and had seen everything just as it had been presented to his own eyes. Moreover, impelled by some inward prompting for which she could never account, she had counted the footsteps as they had ascended the stairs. They had been exactly 17. The pair re-entered their room and took hurried counsel together. They had distinctly seen the captain turn the knob and pass into his bedroom, followed by the semblance of Nero. As they well knew, the door of that room was locked, and the key was at that moment in the pocket of Mrs. Summers' dress. In sheer desperation, they resolved at all hazards to unlock the door and enter the room. Mrs. Summers produced the key and handed it to her husband. She carried the candle and accompanied him to the stairhead. He turned the lock and pushed the door wide open before him, and both advanced into the room. It was empty, and the window was found firmly fastened on the inside, as it had been left weeks before. They returned to their own bedroom and agreed that any further stay in such a house of horrors was not to be thought of. Hastily arraying themselves in such clothing as came readily to hand, they passed down the stairway, unbolted the front door, blew out the light, and made their way into the open air. As they relocked the door from the outside and left the place, then they relocked the door from the outside and left the place. Their intended destination was the house of Mrs. Summers' sister, but they determined to go round by Mr. Washburn's and tell him their story, as they knew he kept late hours and would most likely not have gone to bed. Mr. Washburn, a stolid man of law though he was, could not listen to such a narrative without perceptible signs of astonishment. After thinking over the matter a few moments, he requested his visitors to pass the night under his roof and to keep their own counsel for the present about their strange experiences. As he well knew, if the singular story got wind, there would be no possibility of finding another tenant for the vacant house. The young couple acceded to the first request and promised compliance with the second. They were then shown to a spare room, and the marvels of that strange night were at an end. Next morning, at an early hour, the lawyer and the ex-serving man proceeded to the Duchess Street house. Everything was as it had been left the night before, and no clue could be found to the mysterious circumstances so solemnly attested to by Jim Summers and his spouse. The perfect sincerity of the couple could not be doubted, but Mr. Washburn was on the whole disposed to believe that they had in some way been imposed upon by designing persons who wished to frighten them off the premises, or that their imaginations had played them a scurvy trick. See, pirates. With a renewed caution as to silence, he dismissed them, and they thenceforth took up their abode in the house of Mrs. Summers' sister on Palace Street. Gotta get your lemons. That's why, the captain, he always loved his lemons with his whiskey. He fights off the scurvy. Mr. and Mrs. Summers kept their mouths as closed as, under the circumstances, could reasonably have been expected of them, but it was necessary to account in some way for their sudden desertion of the Duchess Street house, and Mrs. Summers' sister was of an inquisitive disposition. By degrees, she succeeded in getting at most of the facts, but to do her justice, she did not proclaim them from the housetops, and for some time the secret was pretty well kept. The story would probably not have become generally known at all, but for a succession of circumstances which took place when the haunted house had been vacant for about 2 months. An American immigrant named Horstfall arrived at York with a view of settling there and opening out a general store. He was a man of family and of course required a house to live in. It so happened that the store rented to him on King Street had no house attached to it, and it was therefore necessary for him to look out for a suitable place elsewhere. Hearing that a house on Duchess Street was to let, he called and went over to the premises with Mr. Washburn, who naturally kept silent as to the supernatural appearances which had driven the Summerses from the door in the middle of the night. The inspection proved satisfactory, and Mr. Horsfall took the place for a year. His household consisted of his wife, 2 grown-up daughters, a son in his 15th year, and a black female servant. They came up from Utica in advance of Mr. Horsfall's expectations, and before the house was ready for them, but matters were pushed forward with all possible speed, and on the evening of the 2nd day after their arrival, they took possession of the place. The furniture was thrown in higgledy-piggledy, and all attempts to put things right were postponed until the next day. The family walked over after tea from the inn at which they had been staying, resolving to rough it for a single night in their new home in preference to passing another night amid countless swarms of the pestilence that walketh in darkness. I assume they mean poor people. 2 beds were hastily made up on the floor of the drawing room, one for the occupation of Mr. and Mrs. Horsfall, and the other for the 2 young women. Well, it's par for the course with all of our protagonists in these stories. They've all been kind of shitty in that specific way. A 3rd bed was hastily extemporized on the floor for the dining room for the occupation of Master George Washington, and... What? I feel like I had a stroke reading that sentence. Hold on. A 3rd bed was hastily extemporized on the floor of the dining room for the occupation of Master George Washington, and Dinah found repose on a lounge in the adjacent kitchen. Maybe his name was George Washington Horsfall, the son. That must be it. That absolutely must be it. Yeah, that sentence... Yeah, anyway. The entire household went to bed sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock, all pretty well tired and prepared for a comfortable night's rest. They had been in bed somewhat more than an hour when the whole family was aroused by the barking of a dog in the lower hall. This was, not unnaturally, regarded as strange, inasmuch as all the doors and windows had been carefully fastened by Mr. Horsfall before retiring, and there had certainly been no dog in the house then. The head of the family lost no time in lighting a candle and opening the door into the hall. At the same moment, young G.W. Okay, yes, that is the son. At the same moment, young G.W. opened the door on the opposite side. Yes, there, sure enough, was a large black Newfoundland dog, seemingly very much at home, as though he belonged to the place. As the youth advanced toward him, he retreated up to the stairway, up which he passed at a great padding pace. How on earth had he gained entrance? Well, at all events, he must be gotten rid of, but he looked as if he would be an awkward customer to tackle at close quarters, and Mr. Horsfall deemed it prudent to put on part of his clothing before making any attempt to expel him. While he was dressing, the tread of the animal on the floor of the upper hall could be distinctly heard, and ever and anon he emitted a sort of low barking sound, which was ominous of a disposition to resent any interference with him. Oh goodness, this certainly is a paragraph. By this time, all the members of the household were astir and clustering about the lower hall. Mr. Horsfall, with a lighted candle in one hand and a stout cudgel in the other, passed up the stairs and looked along the passage. Why, what on earth had become of the dog? It was nowhere to be seen. And where could it have hidden itself? It was certainly too large an animal to have taken refuge in a rat hole. Had it entered one of the rooms? Impossible, for they were all closed, though not locked. Mr. H. himself having unlocked them in the course of the afternoon, when some furniture had been taken into them. He, however, looked into each room in succession, only to find darkness there and nothing more. Then he concluded that the brute must have gone down the stairs while he had been putting on his clothes in the room below. No, that could not be, for George Washington had never left the foot of the stairway from the moment the dog first passed up. Had it jumped through one of the windows? No, they were all fast and intact. Had it gone up the chimney of the front room? No, apart from the absurdity of the idea, the hole was not large enough to admit a dog 1/5 its size. In vain, the house was searched through and through. Not a sign of the huge disturber of the domestic peace was to be seen anywhere. After a while, Mr. Horsfall, at a loss for anything better to exercise his faculties upon, opened both the front and back doors and looked all over the premises, alternatingly calling Carlo, Watch, and every other name which occurred to him as likely to be borne by a dog. There was no response, and in sheer disgust, he re-entered the house and again sought his couch. Yeah, I'd be hype, dude. Like, that's a dog that you don't have to, like, physically take care of. You get to just enjoy. That's rad. Maybe it's a little loud in the middle of the night, but, you know, big dog. In a few minutes more, the household was again locked in slumber. But they were not at the... maybe common for, you know, the mid to early 1800s. But they were not at the end of their annoyances. About half an hour after midnight, they were once more aroused, this time by the sound of loud voices in the large upper room. I tell you we will have all glasses round, roared a stentorian voice. I will knock down the first man who objects. Everybody in the house heard the voice and the words. This was apparently more serious than the dog. Mr. H regretted that he had left his pistols at the inn, but he determined to rid the place of the intruders wherever they might be. Grasping the cudgel, he again made his way upstairs, candle in hand. When more than half of the way up, he caught sight of a tall, heavily built, red-faced man who had apparently emerged from the larger room and who was just on the point of opening the door of the back bedroom. "Who are you, you scoundrel?" exclaimed Mr. H. The man apparently neither saw nor heard him, but opened the door with tranquil unconcern and passed into the room. Mr. H followed quickly at his very heels, only to find that he had been beguiled with a counterfeit, and that there was no one there. Then he stepped back into the hallway, and entered the larger room with cudgel raised, fully expecting to find several men there. To his unspeakable astonishment, he found nobody. Again, he hurried from room to room, upstairs and downstairs. Again, he examined the doors and windows to see if the fastenings had been tampered with. No, all was tight and snug. The family were again astir, hurrying hither and thither in quest of they knew not what, but they found nothing to reward their search, and after a while all gathered together half-clad in the dining room, where they began to ask each other what these singular disturbances could mean. Mr. Horsfall was a plain, matter-of-fact personage, and up to this moment, no idea of any supernatural visitation had so much as entered his mind. Even now he scouted the idea when it was timidly broached by his wife. He, however, perceived plainly enough that this was something altogether out of the common way, and he announced his intention of going to bed no more that night. The others lay down again, but we may readily believe that they slept lightly, if at all, though nothing more once disturbed them. Soon after daylight, all the family rose and dressed for the day. Once more they made tour after tour through all of the rooms, only to find that everything remained precisely as it had been left on the preceding night. After an early breakfast, Mr. H proceeded to the house of Mr. Washburn, where he found that gentleman was still asleep, and that he could not be disturbed. The visitor was a patient man, and declared his intention of waiting. In about an hour, Mr. Washburn came downstairs, and heard the extraordinary story which his tenant had to relate. He had certainly not anticipated anything of this sort, and gave vehement utterance to his surprise. In reply to Mr. H's inquiries about the house, however, he gave him a brief account of the life and death of Captain Bywater, and supplemented the biography by narration of the singular experiences of Jim Summers and his wife. Then the American fired up, alleging that his landlord had no right to let him the house and to permit him to remove his family into it without acquainting him with the facts beforehand. The lawyer admitted that he had perhaps been to blame and expressed his regret. The tenant declared that the tenant declared that he then and there threw up his tenancy and that he would vacate the house in the course of a day. Mr. Washburn felt that a court of law would probably hesitate to enforce a lease under such circumstances, and assented that the arrangement between them should be treated as cancelled. I would have loved to see that one brought to a court of law. That would have been beautiful. It's a pity that that's not what happened. This is the end. Part 8, The Last of the House. And cancelled it was. Mr. Horsfall temporarily took his family and his other belongings back to the inn, but soon afterwards secured a house where no guests, canine or otherwise, were in the habit of intruding themselves uninvited into the silent watches of the night. He kept a store here for some years, and, I believe, was buried at York. A son of his, as I am informed, probably the same who figures in the foregoing narrative, is, or lately was, a well-to-do resident of Syracuse, New York. Mr. Horsfall made no secret of his reasons for throwing up his tenancy, and his adventures were soon noised abroad throughout the town. He was the last tenant of the somber house. Thenceforth, no one could be induced to rent it or even occupy it rent-free. It was commonly regarded as a wished, gruesome spot and was totally unproductive to its owners. Its subsequent history has already been given. And now, what more is there to tell? Only this, that the main facts of the foregoing story are true. Of course, I am not in a position to vouch for them from personal knowledge, any more than I am in a position to personally vouch for the invasion of England by William of Normandy. But they rest on good evidence, as most other private events of 60-odd years ago, and there is no reason for doubting their literal truth. With regard to the supernatural element, I am free to confess that I am not able to accept it in entirety. This is not because I question the veracity of those who vouch for the alleged facts, but because I have not received those facts at first hand, and because I am not yet ready to believe in the supernatural at all. I think that, in the case under construction, an intelligent investigation at the time might probably have brought to light circumstances as to which the narrative, as it stands, is silent. Be that as it may, the tale is worth the telling, and I have told it. And that's the haunting of the house on Duchess Street. I both hate and deeply appreciate how absolutely smug John Charles Dent is. Yeah, Nero's a pretty good name for a big dog. I gotta be honest, that's a good name. Let's see, we have one more. Saverine's disappearance, a half-forgotten chapter in the history of an upper Canadian township. So, no clue as to the tone of this last story that we'll be reading next week. Perhaps another mystery, perhaps another spooky ghost story. Someone's gone missing. That much I can tell you. But we'll take a short break, and then we'll be back with some House on the Borderlands, where I assumed that the swine things are going to be coming back at some point. The narrative has made a pretty good case to sort of convince us that they might have been entirely in the imagination of our protagonist, but I'm expecting that is going to be a bit of a feint, and that they're gonna come back, like in force at some point. At any rate, I will be right back. Yeah, this album has no business, absolutely no business being as good as it is. And I honestly think it's just a product of when it was produced. It was produced in 1975, and it is sort of just a very well executed, easy listening album, using all of the sort of popular conventions at the time. I'll have to look that up and see the comparison. Yeah, here, I put that in my search info. Anyway. Now, now that we've had our laugh at ghosts, let's get fucking ruined by pig things. So the whole thing with the hole leading underneath the house, I felt like that was very obviously sort of leading into that big open space that was underneath the trap door in the cellar, and I feel pretty vindicated for that thought with our chapter 13 title, "The Trap in the Great Cellar." Yeah, let's get Piggy ruined by pig things. Yeah, that's the new Chuck Tingle novel. Anyway, The Trap in the Great Cellar. I suppose I must have swooned, for the next thing I remember, I opened my eyes and all was dusk. I was lying on my back with one leg doubled under the other, and Pepper was licking my ears. I felt horribly stiff, and my leg was numb from the knee downward. For a few minutes, I lay thus in a dazed condition. Then, slowly, I struggled to a sitting position and looked about me. Yeah, Pepper's the MVP of this whole story. I love Pepper. Very good dog. It had stopped raining, but the trees still dripped dismally. From the pit came a continuous murmur of running water. I felt cold and shivery. My clothes were sodden, and I ached all over. Very slowly, the life came back to my numbed leg, and, after a little, I essayed to stand up. This I managed at the second attempt, but I was very tottery and peculiarly, I cannot say that word for some reason, peculiarly weak. I'll just move on. It seemed to me that I was going to be ill, and I made shift to stumble my way toward the house. My steps were erratic, and my head confused. At each step that I took, sharp pains shot through my limbs. I had gone perhaps some 30 paces when a cry from Pepper drew my attention, and I turned stiffly toward him. The old dog was trying to follow me, but he could come no further, owing to the rope which I had hauled him up, still being tied round his body, the other end not having been unfastened from the tree. For a moment I fumbled with the knots, weakly, but they were wet and hard, and I could do nothing. Then I remembered my knife, and in a minute the rope was cut. How I reached the house I scarcely know, and of the days that followed I remember still less. Of one thing I am certain, that, had it not been for my sister's untiring love and nursing, I had not been writing at this moment. Also Mary, who is just keeping everyone in the house alive. When I recovered my senses, it was to find that I had been in bed for nearly 2 weeks. Yet another week passed before I was strong enough to totter out into the gardens. Even then, I was not able to walk so far as the pit. I would have liked to ask my sister how high the water had risen, but felt it was wiser not to mention the subject to her. Indeed, since then, I had made a rule never to speak to her about the strange things that happened in this great old house. Well, Mary sort of like, she was, seemed to be afraid of the protagonist, like, more afraid of him than, say, the pig things, which again seemed to be the narrative sort of suggesting that they weren't real and that he had just been firing into the garden willy-nilly. But we'll see. We'll see how things go with that. It was not until a couple of days later that I managed to get across to the pit. There, I found that in my few weeks' absence, there had been wrought a wondrous change. Instead of the 3 parts filled ravine, I looked out upon a great lake, whose placid surface reflected in the light coldly. The water had risen to within 6 feet of the pit edge. Only in one part was the lake disturbed, and that was above the place where, far down under the silent waters, yawned the entrance to the vast underground pit. Here, there was a continuous bubbling, and occasionally a curious sort of sobbing gurgle that would find its way up from the depth. Beyond these, there was nothing to tell of the things that were hidden beneath. As I stood there, it came to me how wonderfully things had worked out. The entrance to the place whence the swine creatures had come was sealed up by a power that made me feel there was nothing more to fear from them. And yet, with the feeling, there was a sensation that now I should never learn anything further of the place from which those dreadful things had come. It was completely shut off and concealed from human curiosity forever. Hey, Rosie. You ready for a pig? Or maybe not pig, maybe pig not real. Maybe pig figment of imagination. Strange, in the knowledge of that underground hellhole, how apposite had, apposite? I assume that means something akin to appropriate, had been the naming of the pit. One wonders how it originated and when. Naturally, one concludes that the shape and depth of the ravine would suggest the name pit. Oh, hey, Zeta. Oh, by the way, thanks for following, Zeta. I appreciate it. I did a little heart with my hands, like you can fucking see that, but just know that I did it. Yet, is it not possible that it has all along held a deeper significance, a hint, one could but have guessed, of the greater, more stupendous pit that lies far down in the earth beneath this old house? Under this house! Even now, the idea is strange and terrible to me, for I have proved beyond doubt that the pit yawns right below the house, which is evidently supported, somewhere above the center of it, upon a tremendous arched roof of solid rock. It had happened in this wise that, having occasion to go down to the cellars, the thought occurred to me to pay a visit to the great vault, where the trap is situated, and see whether everything was as I had left it. Reaching the place, I walked slowly up the center until I came to the trap. There it was, with the stones piled upon it, just as I had seen it last. I had a lantern with me, and the idea came to me that now would be a good time to investigate whatever lay underneath the great oak slab. Placing the lantern on the floor, I tumbled the stones off the trap, and, grasping the ring, pulled the door open. As I did so, the cellar became filled with the sound of a murmurous thunder that rose from far below. At the same time, a damp wind blew up into my face, bringing with it a load of fine spray. Therewith, I dropped the trap hurriedly with a half-frightened feeling of wonder. For a moment, I stood puzzled. I was not particularly afraid. The haunting fear of the swine things had left me long ago, but I was certainly nervous and astonished. Then a sudden thought possessed me, and I raised the ponderous door with a feeling of excitement. Leaving it standing upon its end, I seized the lantern and, kneeling down, thrust it into the opening. As I did so, the moist wind and spray drove in my eyes, making me unable to see for a few moments. Even when my eyes were clear, I could distinguish nothing below me save darkness and whirling spray. Seeing that it was useless to expect to make out anything, with the light so high, I felt in my pockets for a piece of twine with which to lower it further into the opening. Even as I fumbled, the lantern slipped from my fingers and hurtled down into the darkness. For a brief instant, I watched it fall and saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam some 80 or 100 feet below me. Then it was gone. My sudden surmise was correct, and now I knew the cause of the wet and the noise. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap, which opened right above it, and the moisture was the spray rising from the water falling into the depths. In an instant, I had an explanation of certain things that had hitherto puzzled me. Now I could understand why the noises on the first night of the invasion had seemed to rise directly from under my feet, and the chuckle that had sounded when I first opened the trap. Evidently, some of the swine things must have been right beneath me. Another thought struck me. Were the creatures all drowned? Would they drown? I remembered how unable I had been to find any traces to show that my shooting had been really fatal. Had they life, as we understand it, or were they ghouls? These thoughts flashed through my brain as I stood in the dark, searching my pockets for matches. I had the box in my hand now, and striking a light, I stepped into the trapdoor and closed it. I stepped to the trapdoor and closed it. Then I piled the stones back upon it, after which I made my way out from the cellars. And so, I suppose, the water goes on, thundering down into that bottomless hell pit. Sometimes I have an inexplicable desire to go down to the great cellar, open the trap, and gaze into the impenetrable spray-damp darkness. At times, the desire becomes almost overpowering in its intensity. It is not mere curiosity that prompts me, but more as though some unexplained influence were at work. Still, I never go, and intend to fight down the strange longing and crush it, even as I would the unholy thought of self-destruction. This idea of some intangible force being exerted may seem reasonless, yet my instinct warns me that it is not so. In these things, reason seems to me less to be trusted than instinct. One thought there is, in closing, that impresses itself upon me with ever-growing insistence. It is that I live in a very strange house, a very awful house, and I've begun to wonder whether I am doing wisely in staying here. Yet, if I left, where could I go, and still obtain the solitude and the sense of her presence that alone made my old life bearable? What is this footnote? If y'all don't mind, I'm just going to open that in a new window, just to make sure we're not going to be spoiling ourselves on anything. Oh, there are just straight up footnotes from the editor here. We House of Leaves now, boys. And lads, and otherwise. And boys and lads, and otherwise, which I guess I mean ladies. Excuse me. I am beside myself. The footnote merely reads, an apparently unmeaning interpolation. I can find no previous reference in the MS to this matter. It becomes clearer, however, in the light of succeeding incidents. Ooh, her presence. What the fuck does that mean? So, no idea what that means. Oh man, just that we are going to that statement will become clearer as we continue. Okay, I will just leave that open in this window, I think, so that we have it in case we come across any further footnotes in the text. All right, one moment. Yes, on Project Gutenberg. You did ask, I forgot to answer it last week, if the idea of this is just to read public domain books. In general, broadly speaking, the idea is just to read, because I like reading out loud, and it's good fun to share stories with people. I'm sticking currently to the public domain works in the on Project Gutenberg because they're readily available and there's no like weirdness with copyright. I'm super down to read other works, and I had some ideas, especially like maybe some nonfiction stuff if you guys would be interested in that, although I don't know if that would just be boring or not. But we'll sort of discuss that once we've finally gotten through this story. I mean, speaking of House of Leaves, I would absolutely love to read House of Leaves for this stream. That would be fantastic. Yeah, I mean, this is like a much less racist Lovecraft. It's still racist against Irish and has a bunch of like very unfortunate references to foreign gods in the early chapters. Yeah, it's been haven't read House of Leaves since high school. Goodness. I'll just throw it out there then, since I've already said nonfiction. I had considered reading The Conquest of Bread for the stream, both because it's a very sort of like interesting work. I have not finished it myself. Robert Dole, maybe. I'm gonna put that name in a tab so that I can look it up later. And at least for the parts I've read of The Conquest of Bread, most especially the first chapter, it does sort of have a good little sense of prose to it. At least to my mind. Well, I'll work around that. That is, as long as we're on side roads, there's one story that I would love to read. However, it's sort of just not my place to read. I do have a yearly reading on Zora Neale Hurston's her birthday. I like to go back and read Sweat, which I could not read because I feel like I would. It has a lot of language that I do not feel it would be appropriate for me to read on stream, and censoring it would, or self-censoring it rather, would, I think, take away too much. But I would encourage everyone to go read Sweat. It's not terribly long, and it's fantastic. Anyway, before we get too distracted here, let's go back to... Oh no, are we going to take another space trip? Let's see. Chapter 14, The Sea of Sleep. I'm going to write some of those down, Zeta. I am a big fan of witches. That's Robert Dahl, isn't it? Yeah, witches. I loved witches. Fantastic story. So that was, Chapter 14, The Sea of Sleep. For a considerable period after the last incident, which I have narrated in my diary, I had serious thoughts of leaving this house, and might have done so, but for the great and wonderful thing of which I am about to write. How well I was advised in my heart when I stayed on here, spite of those visions and sights of unknown and unexplainable things, for had I not stayed, then I had not seen again the face of her I loved. Yes, though few know it, none now save my sister Mary, I have loved and, me, lost. I would write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like the tearing of old wounds. Yet after that which has happened, what need do I have to care? What need have I to care? For she has come to me out of the unknown. Strangely, she warned me passionately against this house, begged me to leave it, but admitted when I questioned her that she should not have come to me had I been elsewhere. Yet in spite of this, still she warned me earnestly, telling me that it was a place long ago given over to evil, and under the power of grim laws of which none here have knowledge, And I just asked her again whether she would come to me elsewhere, and she could only stand silent. It was thus that I came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she termed it, in her dear speech with me. I had stayed up in my study reading and must have dozed off over the book. Suddenly, I awoke and sat upright with a start. For a moment, I looked round with a puzzled sense of something unusual. There was a misty look about the room, given a curious softness to each table and chair and furnishing. Gradually, the mistiness increased, growing, as it were, out of nothing. Then slowly, a soft, white light began to glow in the room. The flames of the candle shone through it palely. I looked from side to side and found that I could still see each piece of furniture, but in a strangely unreal way, more as though the ghost of each table and chair had taken the place of the solid article. Whoops. Gradually, as I looked, I saw them fade and fade until slowly they resolved into nothingness. Now I looked again at the candles. They shone wanly, and even as I watched, grew more unreal, and so vanished. The room was filled now with a soft yet luminous white twilight, like a gentle mist of light. Beyond this, I could see nothing. Even the walls had vanished. Presently, I became conscious that a faint, continuous sound pulsed through the silence that wrapped me. I listened intently. It grew more distinct until it appeared to me that I had harked into the breathings of some great sea. I cannot tell how long a space passed thus, but after a while it seemed that I could see through the mistiness, and slowly I became aware that I was standing upon the shore of an immense and silent sea. This shore was smooth and long, vanishing to the right and left of me in extreme distances. In front swam a still immensity of sleeping ocean. At times it seemed to me that I caught a faint glimmer of light under its surface, but of this I could not be sure. Behind me rose up to an extraordinary height gaunt black cliffs. Overhead, the sky was of a uniform cold gray color, the whole place being lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire that swam a little above the far horizon and shed a foam-like light above the quiet waters. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea, an intense stillness prevailed. For a long while I stayed there, looking out across its strangeness. Then, as I stared, it seemed that a bubble of white foam floated up out of the depths, and then, even now I do not know how it was, I was looking upon, nay, looking into the face of her. Aye, into her face, into her soul, and she looked back at me with such a commingling of joy and sadness that I ran toward her blindly, crying strangely to her in a very agony of remembrance, of terror, and of hope to come to me. Yet, yeah, I've never read that word before. Yet, spite of my crying, she stayed out there upon the sea and only shook her head sorrowfully. But in her eyes was the old earth light of tenderness that I had come to know before all things ere we were parted. At her perverseness, I grew desperate and essayed to wade out to her, though I would, I could not. Some invisible barrier held me back, and I was fain to stay where I was and cry out to her in the fullness of my soul, "Oh, my darling," but could say no more for very intensity. And at that she came over swiftly and touched me, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet when I reached out my hands to her, she put me from her with tenderly stern hands, and I was abashed. The fragments. Oh, let's just check this footnote here. Oh, right. I'm sure this is explaining Here, the writing becomes indecipherable owing to the damaged condition of the part of the MS. Below, I print such fragments as they are legible. Right, if we remember from the very first chapter, this diary was found by Tonneson and Beregnog sort of crushed underneath a pile of stone, and part of it had been thoroughly damaged, and I suppose now we've come to that part. So we're not going to really be able to get the whole story at this point. But yeah, I know, right? It sort of like broke a little bit away from the diegetic, like the framing device, I guess. But yeah, this is meant to be a diary found by two people who just went out fishing one day in the Irish countryside. So this is the legible portions of the mutilated leaves. Through tears, noise of eternity in my ears, we parted. She whom I love, oh my God. I was a great time dazed, and then I was alone in the blackness of the night. I knew that I journeyed back once more to the known universe. Presently I emerged from that enormous darkness. I had come among the stars, vast time, the sun, far and remote. Oh, so we are doing space travel again. I entered into the gulf that separates our system from the outer suns. As I sped across the dividing dark, I watched steadily the ever-growing brightness and size of our sun. Once I glanced back to the stars and saw them shift, as it were, in my wake, against the mighty background of the night, so vast was the speed of my passing spirit. I drew nigher to our system, and now I could see the shine of Jupiter. Later, I distinguished the cold blue gleam of the earthlight. I had a moment of bewilderment. All about the sun there seemed to be bright objects moving in rapid orbits. Inward, nigh to the savage glory of the sun, there circled two darting points of light, and further off there flew a blue shining speck that I knew to be the earth. It circled the sun in a space that seemed to be no more than an earth minute. Nearer with greater speed, I saw the radiances of Jupiter and Saturn spinning with incredible swiftness in huge orbits, and ever I drew more nigh and looked out upon this strange sight, the visible circling of the planets about the mother sun. It was as though time had been annihilated for me, so that a year was no more to my unfleshed spirit than is a moment to an earthbound soul. The speed of the planets appeared to increase, and presently I was watching the sun, all ringed about with hair-like circles of different colored flame, the paths of the planet hurtling at mighty speed about the central flame. The sun grew vast, as though it leapt up to meet me, and now I was within the circling of the outer planets, and flitting swiftly towards the place where the earth, glimmering through the blue splendor of its orbit, as though a fiery mist circled the sun at a monstrous speed. Our third footnote reads, "Note, the severest scrutiny has not enabled me to decipher more of the damaged portion of the MS. It commences to be legible again with a chapter entitled The Noise in the Night." Oh, interestingly, these chapters seem to be, I guess they were all written in like one go each. That does make sense. But they are self-titled by our diary writer. Okay, so The Noise in the Night. Now we are back to the full legibility of the book. So we don't know what our fellow saw in his otherworldly trip, unless he was coming back from the sea that he was at. I don't know. But he didn't travel there as he did the other place. So I don't know. So chapter 15, The Noise in the Night. And now I come to the strangest of all of the strange happenings that have befallen me in this house of mysteries. It occurred quite lately, within the month, and I have little doubt but I have little doubt but that what I saw was in reality the end of all things. However, to my story. I do not know how it is, but up to the present, I have never been able to write these things down. Directly they happened. It is though I have had to wait a time, recovering my just balance and digesting, as it were, the things I had heard or seen. No doubt this is as it should be, for, by waiting, I see the incidents more truly, and write of them in a calmer and more judicial frame of mind. This, by the way. It is now the end of November. My story relates to what happened in the first week of the month. It was night, around 11 o'clock. Pepper and I kept one another company in the study, that great old room of mine, where I read and worked. I was reading, curiously enough, the Bible. I had begun, in these later days, to take a growing interest in that great and ancient book. Suddenly, a distinct tremor shook the house, and there came a faint, distant, whirring buzz that grew rapidly into a far, muffled screaming. It reminded me, in a queer, gigantic way, of the noise that a clock makes when the catch is released, and it is allowed to run down. The sound appeared to come from some remote height somewhere up in the night. There was no repetition of the shock. I looked across at Pepper. He was sleeping peacefully. Gradually, the whirring noise decreased, and there came a long silence. All at once, a glow lit up the end window, which protrudes far out from the side of the house, so that from it one might look both east and west. I felt puzzled, and after a moment's hesitation, walked across the room and pulled aside the blind. As I did so, I saw the sun rise from behind the horizon. It rose with a steady, perceptible movement. I could see it travel upward. In a minute, it seemed, it had reached the tops of the trees through which I had watched it. Up, it was broad daylight now. Behind me, I was conscious of a sharp, mosquito-like buzzing. I glanced round and knew that it came from the clock. Even as I looked, it marked off an hour. The minute hand was moving round the dial faster than an ordinary second hand. The hour hand moved quickly from space to space. I had a numb sense of astonishment. A moment later, so it seemed, the two candles went out almost together. I turned swiftly back to the window, for I had seen the shadow of the window frames traveling along the floor towards me, as though a great lamp had been carried up past the window. I saw now that the sun had risen high into the heavens and was still visibly moving. It passed above the house with an extraordinary sailing kind of motion. As the window came into shadow, I saw another extraordinary thing. The fine weather clouds were not passing easily across the sky. They were scampering as though 100-mile-an-hour wind blew. As they passed, they changed their shape 1,000 times a minute, as though writhing with a strange life, and so were gone. And presently others came and whisked away likewise. To the west, I saw the sun drop with an incredible, smooth, swift motion. Eastward, the shadows of every seen thing crept towards the coming grayness. And the movement of the shadows was visible to me, a stealthy, writhing creep of the shadows of the wind-stirred trees. It was a strange sight. Quickly the room began to darken. The sun slid down to the horizon and seemed, as it were, to disappear from my sight, almost with a jerk. Through the grayness of the swift evening, I saw the silver crescent of the moon falling out of the southern sky toward the west. The evening seemed to merge into an almost instant night. Above me, the many constellations passed in a strange, noiseless circling westward. The moon fell through that last 1,000 fathoms of the night gulf, and there was only the starlight. Around this time, the buzzing in the corner ceased, telling me that the clock had run down. A few minutes passed, and I saw the eastward sky lighten. A gray, sullen morning sped through all the darkness and hid the march of the stars. Overhead there moved with a heavy, everlasting rolling a vast, seamless sky of gray clouds, a cloud sky that would have seemed motionless through all the length of an ordinary Earth day. The sun was hidden from me, but from moment to moment the world would brighten and darken beneath waves of subtle light and shadow. The light shifted ever westward, and the night fell upon the earth. A vast rain seemed to come with it, and a wind of a most extraordinary loudness, as though the howling of a night-long gale, were packed into the space of no more than a minute. This noise passed almost immediately, and the clouds broke so that once more I could see the sky. The stars were flying westward with astounding speed. It came to me now for the first time that, though the noise of the wind had passed, yet a constant blurred sound was in my ears. Now that I noticed it, I was aware that it had been with me all the time. It was the world noise. And then, even as I grasped at so much comprehension, there came the eastward light. No more than a few heartbeats, and the sun rose swiftly. Through the trees I saw it, and then it was above the trees. Up, up it soared, and all the world was light. It passed with a swift, steady swing to its highest altitude, and fell thence westward. I saw the day roll visibly over my head. A few light clouds fluttered northward and vanished. The sun went down with one swift, clear plunge, and there was about me for a few seconds the darker, growing gray of the gloaming. Southward and westward the moon was sinking rapidly. The night had come already. A minute, it seemed, and the moon fell those remaining fathoms of dark sky. Another minute or so, and the eastward sky glowed with the coming dawn, and the sun leapt upon me with a frightening abruptness and soared ever more swiftly towards the zenith. Then suddenly a fresh thing came to my sight. A black thundercloud rushed up out of the south and seemed to leap all the arc of the sky in a single instant. As it came, I saw that its advancing edge flapped like a monstrous black cloth in the heavens, and twirling and undulating rapidly with a horrid suggestiveness. In an instant, all the air was full of rain, and 100 lightning flashes seemed to flood downward as if it were in one great shower. In the same second of time, the world noise was drowned in the roar of the wind, and then my ears ached under the stunning impact of the thunder. And in the midst of this storm, the night came, and then, within the space of another minute, the storm had passed, and there was only the constant blur of the world noise on my hearing. Overhead, the stars were sliding quickly westward, and something, mayhaps the particular speed at which they had attained, brought home to me for the first time a keen realization of the knowledge that it was the world that revolved. I seemed to see, suddenly, the world, a vast, dark mass, revolving visibly against the stars. The dawn and the sun seemed to come together, so greatly had the speed of the world revolution increased. The sun drove up in one long, steady curve, passed its highest point, and swept down into the western sky and disappeared. I was scarcely conscious of evening, so brief was it. Then I was watching the flying constellations and the westward hastening moon, but in but a space of a few seconds, so it seemed, it was sliding swiftly downward through the night blue, and then was gone. And almost directly came the morning. And now there seemed to come a strange acceleration. The sun made one clean, clear sweep through the sky and disappeared behind the westward horizon, and the night came and went with a like haste. As the succeeding day had opened and closed upon the world, I was aware of a sweat of snow suddenly upon the earth. The night came, and almost immediately the day. In the brief leap of the sun, I saw that the snow had vanished, and then, once more, it was night. Thus matters were, and even after the many incredible things that I have seen, I experienced all the time a most profound awe. To see the sun rise and set within the space of a time to be measured by seconds, to watch, after a little, the moon leap, a pale and ever-growing orb, up into the night sky and glide with a strange swiftness through the arc of blue, and presently to see the sun follow, springing out of the eastern sky as though in chase, and then again the night with the swift and ghostly passing of starry constellations was all too much to view believingly. Yet so it was, the day slipping from dawn to dusk, and the night sliding swiftly into day, ever rapidly and more rapidly. The last 3 passages of the sun had shown me a snow-covered earth, which, at night, had seemed for a few seconds incredibly weird under the fast-shifting light of the soaring and falling moon. Now, however, for a little space, the sky was hidden by a sea of swaying leaden white clouds, which lightened and blackened alternatively with the passage of day and night. The clouds rippled and vanished, and there was once more before me the vision of the swiftly leaping sun and nights that came and went like shadows. Faster and faster spun the world, and now each day and night was completed within the space of but a few seconds, and still the speed increased. It was a little later that I noticed that the sun had begun to have a suspicion of a trail of fire behind it. This was due, evidently, to the speed at which it apparently traversed the heavens. And as the days sped to each other, as the days sped, each one quicker than the last, the sun began to assume the appearance of a vast flaming comet, flaring across the sky at short, periodic intervals. Let's take a quick diversion to this. Our footnote number 4 reads, "The recluse uses this as an illustration, evidently in the sense of the popular conception of a comet." I'd forgotten that our main character is referred to as the recluse. At night, the moon presented, with much greater truth, a comet-like aspect, a pale and singularly clear, fast-traveling shape of fire, trailing streaks of cold flame. The stars showed now merely as fine hairs of fire against the dark. Well, his sister and doggo have a name. Yeah, I mean, it's just the recluse because he did not like to leave his house. One moment. Once I turned from the window and glanced at Pepper. In the flash of a day, I saw that he slept quietly, and I moved once more to my watching. The sun was now bursting up from the eastern horizon like a stupendous rocket, seemingly to occupy no more than a second or two in hurtling from east to west. I could no longer perceive the passage of clouds across the sky, which seemed to have darkened somewhat. The brief nights appeared to have lost the proper darkness of night, so that the hairline fire of flying stars showed but dimly. And as the speed increased, the sun began to sway very slowly in the sky, from south to north, and then slowly again from north to south. So, amid a strange confusion of my mind, the hours passed. All this while had Pepper slept. Presently, feeling lonely and distraught, I called to him softly, but he took no notice. Again I called, raising my voice slightly. Still he moved not. I walked over to where he lay and touched him with my foot to rouse him. At the action, gentle though it was, he fell to pieces. That is what happened. He literally and actually crumbled into a moldering heap of bones and dust. For the space of perhaps a minute, I stared down at the shapeless heap that had once been Pepper. I stood, feeling stunned. What can have happened? I asked myself, not at once grasping the grim significance of that little hill of ash. Then, as I stirred the heap with my foot, it occurred to me that this could only happen in a great space of time, years and years. Outside, the weaving, fluttering light held the world. Inside, I stood trying to understand what it meant, what that little pile of dust and dry bones on the carpet meant, but I could not think coherently. I glanced away around the room and now for the first time noticed how dusty and old the place looked. Dust and dirt everywhere, piled in little heaps in the corners and spread about upon the furniture. The very carpet itself was invisible beneath a coating of the same, all-pervading material. As I walked, little clouds of the stuff rose up from under my footsteps and assailed my nostrils with a dry, bitter odor that made me wheeze huskily. Suddenly, as my glance fell again upon Pepper's remains, I stood still and gave voice to my confusion, questioning aloud whether the years were indeed passing, whether this, which I had taken to be a form of vision, was in truth a reality. I paused. A new thought had struck me. Quickly, but with steps which for the first time I noticed tottered, I went across the room to the great pier glass and looked in. It was too covered in grime to give back any reflection, and with trembling hands I began to rub off the dirt. Presently, I could see myself. The thought had come to me, was confirmed. Instead of the great, hale man who scarcely looked 50, I was looking at a bent, decrepit man whose shoulders stooped and whose face was wrinkled with the years of a century. The hair, which a few short hours ago had been nearly coal black, was now silvery white. Only the eyes were bright. Gradually, I traced in that ancient man a faint resemblance to myself of other days. I turned away and tottered to the window. I knew now that I was old, and the knowledge seemed to confirm my trembling walk. For a little space, I stared moodily out into the blurred vista of a changeful landscape. Even in that short time, a year passed, and with a petulant gesture, I left the window. As I did so, I noticed that my hand shook with the palsy of old age, and a short sob choked its way through my lips. For a little while, I paced tumultuously between the window and the table, my gaze wandering hither and thither uneasily. How dilapidated the room was! Everywhere lay the thick dust, thick, sleepy, and black. The fender was a shape of rust. The chains that held the brass clock weights had rusted through long ago, and the weights lay on the floor beneath, themselves 2 cones of verdigris. As I glanced about, it seemed to me that I could see the very furniture of the room rotting and decaying before my eyes. Nor was this fancy on my part, for all at once the bookshelf along the side wall collapsed with a cracking and rending of rotten wood, precipitating its contents upon the floor and filling the room with a smother of dusty atoms. How tired I felt! As I walked, it seemed that I could hear my dry joints creak and crack at every step. I wondered about my sister. Was she dead as well as Pepper? Had all happened so quick? All had happened so quickly and suddenly. This must be indeed the beginning of the end of all things. It occurred to me to go look for her, But I felt too weary, and then she had been so queer about these happenings of late. Of late, I repeated the words and laughed feebly, mirthlessly, as the realization was borne in upon me that I spoke of a time half a century gone. Half a century! It might have been twice as long. I moved slowly to the window and looked out once more across the world. I can best describe the passage of day and night at this period as a sort of gigantic, ponderous flicker. Moment by moment, the acceleration of time continued, so that, at nights now, I saw the moon only as a swaying trail of palish fire that varied from a mere line of light to a nebulous path, and then dwindled again, disappearing periodically. The flicker of the days and nights quickened. The days had grown perceptibly darker, and a queer quality of dust lay, as it were, in the atmosphere. The nights were so much lighter that the stars were scarcely to be seen, saving here and there an occasional hair-like line of fire that seemed to sway a little with the moon. Quicker and ever quicker ran the flicker of day and night, and suddenly it seemed I was aware that the flicker had died out, and instead there reigned a comparatively steady light, which was shed upon all the world, from an eternal river of flame that swung up and down, north and south, in stupendous, mighty swings. The sky was now grown much darker, and there was in the blue of it a heavy gloom, as though a vast blackness peered through it upon the earth. Yet there was in it also a strange and awful clearness and emptiness. Periodically I had glimpses of a ghostly track of fire that swayed thin and darkly toward the sunstream, vanished, and reappeared. It was the scarcely visible moonstream. Looking out at the landscape, I was conscious again of a blurring sort of flitter that came either from the light of the ponderous swinging sunstream, or was the result of the incredibly rapid changes of the Earth's surface, and every few moments, so it seemed, the snow would lie suddenly upon the earth and vanish as abruptly, as though an invisible giant flitted a white sheet on and off the earth. Time fled, and the weariness that was mine grew insupportable. I turned from the window and walked once across the room, the heavy dust deadening the sound of my footsteps. Each step that I took seemed a greater effort than the one before. An intolerable ache knew me in every joint and limb as I trod my way with a weary uncertainty. By the opposite wall, I came to a weak pause and wondered dimly what was my intent. I looked to my left and saw my old chair. The thought of sitting in it brought a faint sense of comfort to my bewildered wretchedness. Yet, because I was so weary and old and tired, I would scarcely brace my mind to do anything but stand and wish myself past those few yards. I rocked as I stood. The floor even seemed a place for rest, but the dust lay so thick and sleepy and black. I turned with a great effort of will and made toward my chair. As I reached it with a groan of thankfulness. I sat down. Everything about me appeared to be growing dim. It was all so strange and unthought of. Last night I was a comparatively strong, though elderly man, and now, only a few hours later, I looked at the little dust heap that had once been Pepper. Hours! And I laughed, a feeble, bitter laugh, a shrill, cackling laugh that shocked my dimming senses. For a while I must have dozed, then I opened my eyes with a start. Somewhere across the room there had been a muffled noise of something falling. I looked and saw vaguely a cloud of dust hovering above a pile of debris. Nearer the door something else tumbled with a crash. It was one of the cupboards, but I was tired and took little notice. I closed my eyes and sat there in a state of drowsy, semi-unconsciousness. Once or twice, as though coming through thick mists, I heard noises faintly. Then I must have slept. It'd be really mean of me to stop right then, wouldn't it? We're going to keep going. But it would be really mean of me to stop right then. Yeah, that was a pretty intense chapter. Yeah! Well, and so on to Chapter 16, The Awakening. I awoke with a start. For a moment, I wondered where I was. Then memory came to me. The room was still lit with that strange light, half sun, half moonlight. I felt refreshed, and the tired, weary ache had left me. I went slowly across the window and looked out. Overhead, the river of flame drew up and down, north and south, in a dancing semicircle of fire. As a mighty sleigh in the loom of time, it seemed, in a sudden fancy of mine, to be beating home the picks of the years. For so vastly had the passage of time been accelerated that there was no longer any sense of the sun passing from east to west. The only apparent movement was the north and south beat of the sun stream, that had become so swift now as to be better described as a quiver. As I peered out, there came to me a sudden, inconsequent memory of that last journey among the outer worlds. I remembered the sudden vision that had come to me as I neared the solar system, of the fast whirling planets about the sun, as though the governing quality of time had been held in abeyance, and the machine of a universe allowed to run down an eternity in a few moments or hours. The memory passed, along with a, but partially comprehended, suggestion that I had been permitted a glimpse into further time spaces. I stared out again, seemingly at the quake of the sun stream. The speed seemed to increase even as I looked. Several lifetimes came and went as I watched. Suddenly, it struck me with a sort of grotesque seriousness that I was still alive. I thought of Pepper and wondered how it was that I had not followed his fate. He had reached the time of his dying, had passed, probably through sheer length of years, and here I was alive. And here was I, alive, hundreds of thousands of centuries after my rightful period of years. For a time I mused absently. Yesterday, I stopped. Suddenly, yesterday, there was no yesterday. The yesterday of which I had spoken had been swallowed up in the abyss of years, ages gone. I grew dazed with much thinking. Presently, I turned from the window and glanced round the room. It seemed different, strangely, utterly different. Then I knew what it was that made it appear so strange. It was bare. There was not a piece of furniture in the room, not even a solitary fitting of any sort. Gradually, my amazement went as I remembered that this was but the inevitable end of a process of decay, which I had witnessed commencing before my sleep, thousands of years, millions of years. Over the floor was spread a deep layer of dust that reached halfway up to the window seat. It had grown immeasurably whilst I slept, and represented the dust of untold ages. Undoubtedly, atoms of the old decayed furniture helped to swell its bulk, and somewhere among it all moldered the long-ago dead pepper. All at once, it occurred to me that I had no recollection of wading knee-deep through all that dust after I awoke. True, an incredible age of years had passed since I approached the window, but that was evidently as nothing compared to the countless space of time that I conceived had vanished while I was sleeping. I remembered now that I had fallen asleep sitting in my old chair. Had it gone? I glanced toward where it had stood. Of course, there was no chair to be seen. I could not satisfy myself whether it had disappeared after my waking or before. If it had moldered under me, surely I should have been waked by the collapse, and then I remembered that the thick dust which covered the floor would have been sufficient to soften my fall, so that it was quite possible I had slept upon the dust for 1,000,000 years or more. As these thoughts wandered through my brain, I glanced again casually to where the chair had stood, and then for the first time noticed that there were no marks in the dust of my footprints between it and the window. But then ages of years had passed since I had awakened, tens of thousands of years. My look rested thoughtfully again upon the place where once had stood my chair. Suddenly, I passed from abstraction to intentness, for there, in its standing place, I made out a long undulation rounded off with the heavy dust. Yet it was not so much hidden, but that I could tell what had caused it. I knew and shivered at the knowledge that it was a human body, ages dead, lying there beneath the place where I had slept. It was lying on its right side, its back turned toward me. I could make it out and trace each... Oh? Did we lose connection? No? Okay. The stream preview died. Yeah, no, the stream preview died and I saw it out of the corner of my ear. Spooked me a little bit. No, we're good. Good. Okay. Back to the horror. Where was I? It was lying on its right side, its back turned toward me. I could make out and trace each curve and outline softened and molded, as it were, in the black dust. I said I. I might have said ear, I don't know. In a vague sort of way, I tried to account for its presence there. Slowly, I began to grow bewildered as the thought came to me that it lay just about where I must have fallen when the chair collapsed. Gradually, an idea began to form itself within my brain, a thought that shook my spirit. It seemed hideous and insupportable, yet it grew upon me steadily until it became a conviction. The body under that coating, that shroud of dust, was neither more or less than my own dead shell. I did not attempt to prove it. I knew it now, and wondered I had not known it all along. I was a bodiless thing. A while I stood, trying to adjust my thoughts to this new problem. In time, how many thousands of years I know not, I attained to some degree of quietude sufficient to enable me to pay attention to what was transpiring around me. Now I saw that the elongated mound had shrunk, collapsed, level with the rest of the spreading dust, and fresh atoms, impalpable, had settled above that mixture of grave powder which the aeons had ground. A long while I stood, turned from the window. Gradually I grew more collected, while the world slipped across the centuries into the future. Presently I began a survey of the room. Now I saw that time was beginning its destructive work even on this strange old building. That it had stood through all the years was, it seemed to me, proof that it was somehow different from any other house. I do not think, somehow, that I had thought of its decaying, though why I could not have said. It was not until I had meditated upon the matter for some considerable time that I fully realized that the extraordinary space of time through which it had stood was sufficient to have utterly pulverized the very stones upon which it was built. Had they been taken from any earthly quarry, yes, it was undoubtedly moldering now. All of the plaster had gone from the walls, even as the woodwork of the room had gone many ages before. While I stood in contemplation, a piece of glass from one of the small diamond-shaped panes dropped with a dull tap amid the dust upon the sill behind me, and crumbled into a little heap of powder. As I turned from contemplating it, I saw light between a couple of the stones that formed the outer wall. Evidently, the mortar was falling away. After a while, I turned once more to the window and peered out. I discovered now that the speed of time had become enormous. The lateral quiver of the sunstream had grown so swift as to cause the dancing semicircle of flame to merge into and disappear in a sheet of fire that covered half the southern sky from east to west. From the sky, I glanced down to the gardens. They were just a blur of palish dirty green. I had a feeling that they stood higher than in the old days, a feeling that they were nearer my window as though they had risen bodily. Yet they were still a long way below me, for the rock over the mouth of the pit on which the house stands, arches up to a great height. It was later that I noticed a change in the constant color of the gardens. The pale, dirty green was growing ever paler and paler toward white. At last, after a great space, they became grayish-white and stayed thus for a very long time. Finally, however, the grayness began to fade, even as had the green, into a dead white, and this remained constant and unchanged. And by this I knew that, at last, snow lay upon all the northern world. And so, by millions of years, time winged onward through eternity, to the end of which in the old Earth days I had thought remotely and in hazily speculative fashion, and now it was approaching in a manner of which none had ever dreamed. I recollect that about this time I began to have a lively though morbid curiosity as to what would happen when the end came, but I seemed strangely without imaginings. All this while, the steady process of decay was continuing. The few remaining pieces of glass had long ago vanished, and every now and then a soft thud and a little cloud of rising dust would tell of some fragment of fallen mortar or stone. I looked up again to the fiery sheet that quaked in the heavens above me and far down into the southern sky. As I looked, the impression was borne in upon me that it had lost some of the first brilliancy, that it was duller, deeper hued. I glanced down once more to the blurred white of the worldscape. Sometimes my look returned to the burning sheet of dulling flame that was, and yet hid, the sun. At times I glanced behind me into the growing dust of the great silent room, with its aeon carpet of sleeping dust. So I watched through the fleeting ages, lost in soul-wearying thoughts and wonderings, and possessed with a new weariness. Hmm. Yeah, to put it lightly. Chapter 17, The Slowing Rotation. It might have been 1,000,000 years later that I perceived, beyond possibility of doubt, that the fiery sheet that lit the world was indeed darkening. Another vast space went by, and the whole enormous flame had sunk to a deep copper color. Gradually it darkened from copper to copper red, and from this, at times, to a deep, heavy, purplish tint with, in it, a strange loom of blood. Although the light was decreasing, I could perceive no diminishment in the apparent speed of the sun. It still sped itself in that dazzling veil of speed. The world, so much of it as I could see, had assumed a dreadful shade of gloom, as though in very deed the last day of the worlds approached. The sun was dying, of that there could be little doubt, and still the earth whirled onward through space and all the aeons. And this time, I remembered, an extraordinary sense of bewilderment took me. I found myself later wandering mentally amid an old chaos of fragmentary modern theories and the old biblical story of the world's ending. Then, for the first time, there flashed across me the memory that the sun, with its system of planets, was, and had been, traveling through space at an incredible speed. Abruptly, the question rose, where? For a very great time, I pondered this matter, but finally, with a certain sense of the futility of my puzzlings, I let my thoughts wander to other things. I grew to wondering how much longer the house would stand. Also, I queried to myself whether I should be doomed to stay bodiless upon the earth through the dark time that I knew was coming. From these thoughts, I fell again to speculations upon the possible direction of the sun's journey through space, and so another great while passed. Gradually, as time fled, I began to feel the chill of a great winter. Then I remembered that, with the sun dying, the cold must be, necessarily, extraordinarily intense. Slowly, as the aeons slipped into eternity, the earth sank into a heavier and redder gloom. The dull flame in the firmament took on a deeper tint, very somber and turbid. Then, at last, it was borne upon me that there was a change. The fiery, gloomy curtain of flame that hung quaking overhead and down away into the southern sky began to thin and contract, and in it, as one sees the fast vibrations of a jarred harpstring, I saw once more the sunstream quivering giddily north and south. Slowly the likeness to a sheet of fire disappeared, and I saw plainly the slowing beat of the sunstream. Yet, even then, the speed of its swirling was inconceivably swift, and all the time the brightness of the fiery arc grew ever duller. Underneath the world loomed dimly an indistinct, ghostly region. Overhead, the river of flames swayed slower and even slower until at last it swung to the north and south in great, ponderous beats that lasted through seconds. A long space went by, and now each sway of the great belt lasted nigh a minute, so that after a great while I ceased to distinguish it as a visible movement, and the streaming fire ran in a steady river of dull flame across the deadly-looking sky. An indefinite period passed, and it seemed that the arc of fire became less sharply defined. It appeared to me to grow more attenuated, and, I thought, blackish streaks showed occasionally. Presently, as I watched, the smooth onward flow ceased, and I was able to perceive that there came a momentary but regular darkening of the world. This grew until once more night descended in short but periodic intervals upon the wearying earth. Longer and longer became the nights, and the days equaled them, so that at last the day and the night grew to duration of seconds in length, and the sun showed once more like an almost invisible coppery red ball within the glowing mistiness of its flight, corresponding to dark lines showing at times in its trail. There were now distinctly to be seen on the half-visible sun itself great dark belts. Year after year flashed into the past, and the days and nights spread into minutes. The sun had ceased to have the appearance of a tail, and now rose and set, a tremendous globe of a glowing copper-bronze hue, in parts ringed with blood-red bands, and others with dusky ones that I had already mentioned. These circles, both red and black, were of varying thickness. For a time, I was at a loss to account for their presence. Then it occurred to me that it was scarcely likely that the sun would cool evenly all over, and that these markings were due probably to the differences in temperature of the various areas, the red representing those parts where the heat was still fervent, and the black those portions which were already comparatively cool. It struck me as a peculiar thing that the sun should cool in evenly defined rings, until I remembered that, possibly, they were but isolated patches to which the enormous rotatory speed of the sun had imparted a belt-like appearance. The sun itself was very much greater than the sun I had known in the old world days, and from this I argued that it was considerably nearer. At nights the moon still showed, but small and remote, and the light she reflected was so dull and weak that she seemed little more than the small, dim ghost of the olden moon that I had known. Let's see here. Footnote number 6. No further mention is made of the moon. From the story or just in general? No further mention is made of the moon. From what is said here, it is evident that our satellite had greatly increased its distance from the Earth. Possibly, at a later age, it may even have broken loose from our attraction. I cannot but regret that no light is shed on this point. These are all made by the editor, of course. Goodness. Gradually, the days and nights lengthened out until they equaled a space somewhat less than one of the old Earth hours, the sun rising and setting like a great ruddy bronze disk crossed with ink-black bars. About this time, I found myself able once more to see the gardens with clearness. For the world had now grown very still and changeless. Yet I am not correct in saying gardens, for there were no gardens, nothing that I knew or recognized. In place thereof, I looked out upon a vast plain, stretching away into distance. A little to my left, there was a low range of hills. Everywhere there was a uniform white covering of snow, in places rising into hummocks and ridges. It was only now that I recognized how really great had been the snowfall. In places it was vastly deep, as was witnessed by a great unleaping wave-shaped hill away to my right, though it is not impossible that this was due in part to some rise in the surface of the ground. Strangely enough, the range of low hills to my left, already mentioned, was not entirely covered with the universal snow. Instead, I could see their bare, dark sides showing in several places, and everywhere and always there reigned an incredible death silence and desolation, the immutable, awful quiet of a dying world. All this time, the days and nights were lengthening perceptibly. Already, each day occupied maybe some 2 hours from dawn to dusk. At night, I had been surprised to find that there were very few stars overhead, and these small, though of an extraordinary brightness, which I attributed to the peculiar but clear blackness of the nighttime. Away to the north, I could discern a nebulous sort of mistiness, not unlike in appearance to a small portion of the Milky Way. It might have been an extremely remote star cluster, or the thought came to me suddenly, perhaps it was the sidereal universe that I had known, and now far left behind, forever, a small, dimly glowing mist of stars far in the depths of space. Still the days and nights lengthened slowly, each time the sun rose duller than it had set, and the dark belts increased in breadth. About this time there happened a fresh thing. Oh no. The sun, earth, and sky were suddenly darkened, and apparently blotted out for a brief space. I had a sense, a certain awareness, I could learn little by sight, that the earth was enduring a great fall of snow, and then, in an instant, the veil that had obscured everything vanished, and I looked out once more. A marvelous sight met my gaze. The hollow in which this house, with its garden, stands was brimmed with snow. And footnote number 7. Conceivably frozen air. Conceivably frozen air is what the footnote number 7 says. It lipped over the sill of my window. Everywhere it lay, a great level stretch of white which caught and reflected gloomily the somber coppery glows of the dying sun. The world had become a shadowless plain from horizon to horizon. I glanced up at the sun. It shone with an extraordinary dull clearness. I saw it now as one who until then had seen it only through a partially obscuring medium. All about it the sky had become black, with a clear, deep blackness, frightful in its nearness and its unmeasured deep, and its utter unfriendliness. For a great time I had looked into it, newly and shaken and fearful. It was so near. Had I been a child, I might have expressed some of my sensation and distress by saying that the sky had lost its roof. Later, I turned and peered about me into the room. Everywhere, it was covered in a thin shroud of the all-pervading white. I could see it but dimly by reason of the somber light that now lit the world. It appeared to cling to the ruined walls, and the thick, soft dust of the years that covered the floor knee-deep was nowhere visible. The snow must have blown it through the open framework of the windows. Yet, in no place had it drifted, but lay everywhere about the great old room smooth and level. Moreover, there had been no wind these many thousand years, but there was the snow, as I had told. Footnote number 8. See previous footnote. This would explain the snow within the room. Snow ? So yeah, the atmosphere froze, I guess, is what's happening here. And all the earth was silent, and there was a cold such as no living man can ever have known. The earth was now illuminated by day with a most doleful light, beyond my power to describe. It seemed as though I looked at the great plain through the medium of a bronze-tinted sea. It was evident that the Earth's rotatory movement was departing, steadily. The end came all at once. The night had been the longest yet, and when the dying sun showed at last above the world's edge, I had grown so wearied of the dark that I greeted it as a friend. It rose steadily until about 20 degrees above the horizon. Then it stopped suddenly, and, after a strange retrograde movement, hung motionless, a great shield in the sky. Only the circular rim of the sun showed bright. Only this, and one thin streak of light near the equator. Gradually, even this thread of light died out, and now all that was left of our great and glorious sun was a vast, dead disk rimmed with a thin circle of bronze-red light. Footnote number 9. I am confounded that neither here nor later on does the recluse make any further mention of the continued north and south movement, apparent, of course, of the sun from solstice to solstice. I mean, okay, so apparently the rotation on axis has also stopped. Well, that's a title. One moment. Oh, goodness. I certainly didn't expect this turn to the story. Goodness. Okay. Yeah, Pepper's long gone. I don't know, Mooney. I I have no idea what is about to happen, which is exciting. But the story literally could take any direction from here. One thing you cannot accuse the house on the Borderland of at all is being predictable. That is not a fair accusation in the least. It did. I mean, it started with his soul floating out of his body and traveling into deep space to another galaxy or universe or something. And then pig things, and then this. At any rate, Chapter 18, The Green Star. The world was held in a savage gloom, cold and intolerable. Outside, all was quiet. Quiet. From the dark room behind me came the occasional soft thud of falling matter, fragments of rotting stone. So time passed, and the night grasped the world, wrapping it in wrappings of impenetrable blackness. Let's see here. Footnote number 10. At this time, the sound-carrying atmosphere must have been either incredibly attenuated or more probably non-existent. In the light of this, it cannot be supposed that these or any other noises would have been apparent to living ears, to hearing as we in the material body understand that sense. So luckily, our friend here has ghost ears. Well, I guess you're sort of like feeling the thud. So no, he was not hearing anything. It was very quiet. There was no night sky as we know it. Even the few straggling stars had vanished conclusively. I might have been in a shuttered room without a light for all that I could see. Only in the impalpableness of gloom opposite burnt that vast, encircling hair of dull fire. Beyond this, there was no ray in all the vastitude of night that surrounded me, save that far in the north, that soft, mist-like glow still shone. Silently, years moved on. What period of time passed, I shall never know. It seemed to me, waiting there, that eternities came and went, stealthily, and still I watched. I could see only the glow of the sun's edge at times, for now it had commenced to come and go, lighting up a while and again becoming extinguished. All at once, during one of these periods of life, a sudden flame cut across the night. A quick glare that lit up the dead earth shortly, giving me a glimpse of its flat lonesomeness. The light appeared to come from the sun, shooting out from somewhere near its center diagonally. A moment I gazed, startled. Then the leaping flame sank and the gloom fell again. But now it was not so dark, and the sun was belted by a thin line of vivid white light. I stared intently. Had a volcano broken out on the sun? Yet I negatived the thought as soon as it was formed. I felt that the light had been far too intensely white and large for such a cause. Another idea there was that suggested itself to me. It was that one of the inner planets had fallen into the sun, become incandescent under that impact. This theory appealed to me as being more plausible and accounting more satisfactorily for the extraordinary size and brilliance of that blaze that had lit up the dead world so unexpectedly. Full of interest and emotion, I stared across the darkness at that line of white fire cutting the night. One thing it told me unmistakably: the sun was yet rotating at an enormous speed. Let's see here, footnote number 11. I can only suppose that the time of the Earth's yearly journey had ceased to bear its present relative proportion to the period of the sun's rotation. I'm glad we're getting all of these astronomy notes from our editor here. Thus, I knew that the years were still fleeting at an incalculable rate, though, so far as the Earth was concerned, life and light and time were things belonging to a period lost in the long gone ages. After that one burst of flame, the light had shone only as an encircling band of bright fire. Now, however, as I watched, it began slowly to sink into a ruddy tint, and later to a dark copper-red color, much as the sun had done. Presently it sank to a deeper hue, and in a still further space of time, it began to fluctuate, having periods of glowing and anon dying. Thus, after a great while, it disappeared. Long before this, the smoldering edge of the sun had deadened into blackness, and so in that supremely future time, the world, dark and immensely silent, rode on its gloomy orbit around the ponderous mass of the dead sun. My thoughts at this period can scarcely be described. At first they were chaotic and wanting in coherence, but later, as the ages came and went, my soul seemed to imbibe the very essence of the oppressive solitude and dreariness that held the earth. With this feeling there came a wonderful clearness of thought, and I realized, despairingly, that the world might wander forever through that enormous night. For a while the unwholesome ideal filled me with a sensation of overbearing desolation, so that I could have cried like a child. In time, however, this feeling grew almost insensibly less, and an unreasoning hope possessed me. Patiently, I waited. From time to time, the noise of dropping particles behind in the room came dully to my ears. Once I heard a loud crash, and turned instinctively to look, forgetting for the moment that the impenetrable night in which every detail was submerged. In a while my gaze sought the heavens, turning unconsciously toward the north. Yes, the nebulous glow still showed. Indeed, I could have almost imagined that it looked somewhat plainer. For a long time I kept my gaze fixed upon it, feeling in my lonely soul that its soft haze was, in some way, a tie with the past. Strange the trifles from which one can suck comfort. And yet had I but known, but I shall come to that in its proper time. For a very long space I watched, without experiencing any of the desire for sleep that would so soon have visited me in the old earth days. How I should have welcomed it, if only to have passed the time away from my perplexities and thoughts. Several times the comfortless sound of some great piece of masonry falling disturbed my meditations, and once it seemed I could hear whispering in the room behind me. Yet it was utterly useless to try to see anything. Such blackness as existed scarcely can be conceived. It was palpable and hideously brutal to the senses, as though something dead pressed up against me, something soft and icily cold. Under all this, there grew up within my mind a great and overwhelming distress of uneasiness that left me but to drop me into an uncomfortable brooding. I felt that I must fight against it, and presently, hoping to distract my thoughts, I turned to the window and looked up toward the north, in search of the nebulous whiteness, which, still, I believed to be the far and misty glowing of the universe we had left. Even as I raised my eyes, I was thrilled with a feeling of wonder, for now the hazy light had resolved into a single great star of vivid green. As I stared, astonished, the thought flashed into my mind that the Earth must be traveling toward the star, not away, as I had imagined. Next, that it could not be the universe the Earth had left, but possibly an outlying star belonging to some vast star cluster hidden in the enormous depths of space. With a sense of commingled awe and curiosity, I watched it, wondering what new thing was to be revealed to me. For a while, vague thoughts and speculations occupied me, during which my gaze dwelt insatiably upon that one spot of light in the otherwise pit-like darkness. Hope grew up within me, banishing the oppression of despair that had seemed to stifle me. Wherever the earth was traveling, it was, at least, going once more toward the realms of light. Light. One must spend an eternity wrapped in soundless night to understand the full horror of being without it. Slowly, but surely, the star grew upon my vision, until it shone as brightly as had the planet Jupiter in the old Earth days. With increased size, its color became more impressive, reminding me of a huge emerald scintillating rays of fire across the world. Years away in the silence, years fled away in silence, and the green star flew into a great splash of flame in the sky. A little later, I saw a thing that filled me with amazement. It was the ghostly outline of a vast crescent in the night, a gigantic new moon seeming to be growing out of the surrounding gloom. Utterly bemused, I stared at it. It appeared to be quite close, comparatively, and I puzzled to understand how the Earth had come so near it without my having seen it before. The light thrown by the star grew stronger, and presently I was aware that it was possible to see the Earthscape again, though indistinctly. A while I stared, trying to make out whether I could distinguish any detail of the world's surface, but I found the light insufficient. In a little I gave up on the attempt and glanced once more toward the star. Even in the short space that my attention had been diverted, it had increased considerably, and seemed now to my bewildered sight about a quarter of the size of the full moon. And the light it threw was extraordinarily powerful, yet its color was so abominably unfamiliar that such of the world I could see showed unreal, more as though I looked out upon a landscape of shadow than aught else. All this time, the great crescent was increasing in brightness, and began now to shine with a perceptible shade of green. Steadily, the star increased in size and brilliancy until it showed fully as large as half a full moon, and as it grew greater and brighter, so did the vast crescent throw out more and more light, though of an even ever deepening hue of green. Under the combined blaze of their radiances, the wilderness that stretched before me became steadily more visible. Soon I seemed able to stare across the whole world, which now appeared beneath a strange light, terrible in its cold and awful flat dreariness. Nice. It was a little later that my attention was drawn to the fact that this great star of green flame was so slowly sinking out of the north toward the east. At first, I could scarcely believe that I saw aright, but soon there could be no doubt that it was so. Gradually, it sank, and as it fell, the vast crescent of glowing green began to dwindle and dwindle until it became a mere arc of light against the livid colored sky. Later, it vanished, disappearing into the selfsame spot from which I had seen it slowly emerge. By this time, the star had come to within some 30 degrees of the hidden horizon. In size, it could now have rivaled the moon at its full, though, even yet, I could not distinguish its disk. This fact led me to conceive that it was still an extraordinary distance away, and this being so, I knew that its sides must be huge, beyond the conception of man to understand or imagine. Yeah, what he thought was like the Milky Way up to the north was actually something the Earth was traveling toward, and green sun. Time's still going super fast. Suddenly, as I watched, the lower edge of the star vanished, cut by a straight, dark line. A minute or century passed, and it dipped lower until half of it had disappeared from sight. Far away out in the great plain, I saw a monstrous shadow blotting it out, and advancing swiftly. Only a third of the star was visible now. Then, like a flash, the solution of this extraordinary phenomenon revealed itself to me. The star was sinking behind the enormous mass of the dead sun. Or rather, the sun, obedient to its attraction, was rising toward it, with the earth following in its trail. As these thoughts expanded in my mind, the star vanished, being completely hidden by the tremendous bulk of the sun. Over the earth there fell once more the brooding night. And number 12. A careful reading of the MS suggests that either the sun is traveling on an orbit of great eccentricity, or else that it was approaching the green star on a lessening orbit. At this moment, I conceive it to be finally torn directly from its oblique course by the gravitational pull of the immense star. With the darkness came an intolerable feeling of loneliness and dread. For the first time, I thought of the pit and its inmates. After that, there rose in my memory the still more terrible thing that had haunted the shores of the Sea of Sleep and lurked in the shadows of this old building. Where were they? I wondered and shivered with miserable thoughts. For a time, fear held me, and I prayed, wildly and incoherently, for some ray of light with which to dispel the cold blackness that enveloped the world. How long I waited, it is impossible to say, certainly for a very great period. Then, all at once, I saw a loom of light shine out ahead. Gradually, it became more distinct. Suddenly, a ray of vivid green flashed across the darkness. At the same moment, I saw a thin line of livid flame far in the night. An instant, it seemed, and it had grown into a great clot of fire beneath which the world lay bathed in a blaze of emerald green light. Steadily it grew until presently the whole of the green star had come into sight again. But now it could scarcely be called a star, for it had increased to vast proportions, being incomparably greater than the sun had been in the olden time. Then, as I stared, I became aware that I could see the edge of the lifeless sun glowing like a great crescent moon. Slowly, its lighted surface broadened out to me until half of its diameter was visible, and the star began to drop away on my right. Time passed, and the earth moved on, slowly traversing the tremendous face of the dead sun. Gradually, as the earth traveled forward, the star fell still more to the right, until at last it shone on the back of the house, sending a flood of broken rays in through skeleton-like walls. Glancing upward, I saw that much of the ceiling had vanished, enabling me to see that the upper stories were even more decayed. The roof had evidently gone entirely, and I could see the green effulgence of the starlight shining in slantingly, excuse me. Hmm. I'm sort of caught between whether I want to pause here or continue on. If we continue on, this will be the last chapter. Hmm. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll call it here. It's been 3 hours. And we will pick back up with chapter 19, the end of the solar system. Yeah, I was kind of torn. Like, I wanted to continue just so I could see more, to be honest. Uh, but yeah, I think calling it here is a better plan. Yeah, I'm really happy with this story. I believe there are... Let me see here. Thanks for coming, y'all. I enjoy reading these and doing the streams and everything, but it's always a lot more fun whenever folks are talking in the chat. It's great to have, like, people to bounce off of and, like, share these reactions with. That's sort of the fun of doing this for me. And it's been a treat. But let me see here. Let me turn this down just a little bit. There are a total of 27 chapters. So, we're nearing the end. Please don't be worried about interrupting, because what I'm doing is I'm waiting for proper moments, or especially between chapters. I've actually enjoyed, for tonight, that's been more of a thing where we're stopping in between chapters to sort of, like, have a, talk about, like, what happened. But, please don't worry about interrupting, because other people in the chat can talk to you, and, like, if I want to address something that someone's saying, I will, but I'm pretty focused in on the story. I know a lot of it was just sort of like everyone sitting silently like, oh man, this is bleak. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how this is all going to wrap up. I am a little worried that it can't possibly be done satisfactorily, right? I mean, maybe it's just gonna have a really bleak, weird ending. Chapter 19, the end of the solar system, is where we'll be picking up. So 19 out of 27. Like, we're nearing the end, but we're not. We got a good ways to go. I don't know. I assume he's writing, right? He's writing all of this? And he said this happened at the beginning of November, and it's now the end of November. So, at some point, he's going to get to go back to his body and his time to talk about this. And then, at some point, the whole house is going to get destroyed so that our framing device characters can come across it. Also, because the house was suspended over the pit, that's an important difference, where the house, as it exists now, in the diary story, is a little bit away from the pit. Our framing characters found it sort of like suspended over maybe a bigger pit, so I don't know, like something's gonna collapse. Yeah, Ghost Diary of the Recluse. I mean, there's gonna be something going on in that basement area. I don't know what, if it's the swine things doing something, or they seem to have completely exited the story at this point. Although there was a giant, like, at the very, very beginning, in the arena, there was a giant swine thing trying to get into a giant version of the house. And so, like, that was something that happened. Who knows what that means? I started to think, like, oh, maybe that vision of the arena was actually him traveling to the Earth in the future, and that he was basically starting to describe the flattened out arena. But it really wasn't, and also we're at a green sun, and that whole area had a red sun and red lighting. So I don't know how that's going to, like, connect to what we have and what we are doing. Yeah, that was also, like, a possible thought. Like, the swine people were like, he's gone insane, and they're just Irish villagers. And I don't know. I don't know what to think about any of it at this point. Oh my goodness. Well, I missed Wednesday's stream this past week because I was not feeling well. But I have been thinking, yeah, that's what I feel like the story is sort of like wanting you to think at the very least. But I've had a thought, and I don't know if I really want to come back to trial Journey to a Savage Planet for Wednesday. Maybe we'll come back to it at some point, but it's just not, it's not appealing. And I had thought about some other things to potentially stream, and I did want to see what you guys thought. Evelyn, you were there the last time I streamed it, actually, and it just, like, it was just wearing on me. Like, I kind of am interested in what's gonna happen. Also, like, the sort of Metroid elements of it were maybe a little bit lacking of what I wanted out of it. I'd like to, like I said, I'd like to go back and finish it someday, but just not now. So the first thought that I had, is a particular series that is near and dear to my heart, and I don't know if anyone has any, experience with it. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about it, about, like, if that would be something you guys like to see, or would be interested in. It's also something I would maybe like to invite maybe 1 or 2 people onto the stream to kind of talk about. Which one? The one that I said that Zeta was talking about that I really liked? Witches? Or do you mean House of Leaves? Oh, Sweat! It's a short story, and you can just find that online. I can even just send you a link if you like. It's Zora Neale Hurston. Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston. I'll send you a link to Sweat. It's just, it's pretty, like... Yeah, we might, I don't know if I want to have guests for the reading streams, although definitely I'm super down for, like, people talking in chat about it, and then having discussions there. Maybe I could see, like... I could maybe see doing, like, some roundtable stuff, after some books. That would be interesting. That's definitely an idea I'm gonna put in my pocket there. But, sorry, I was getting roundabout to the game that I might be wanting to stream on Wednesdays, and, well, it's a series of games that are near and dear to my heart, as a young baby Stony, and that would be the Legacy of Kain games, being Blood Omen, Soul Reaver, and then Blood Omen 2, Soul Reaver 2. Okay, well, Zeta's down for that. Is anyone not familiar with those? The best shorthand description I could give of them is that they are very... Oh, that's okay, Mooney. I had a lot of fun streaming Dark Souls with you, and you ever want me to pop on for Dark Souls, I'm damn fine for that. Legacy of Kain is it was a long-running series. It's very, very dead now. It's a very, very 90s gothic vampire fantasy series. The first game, and we'll go ahead and spoil some of the first game. And that's going to be okay, because, like, it's sort of like a given from the second one. So the first game is Blood Omen. You play as Kain, with a K with a K, K-I-N, K-A-I-N, Kain. So, you know, very edgy. Yeah, what Zeta said. He's like a shitty nobleman guy who gets accosted by vandals and turned into a vampire. He has to do a bunch of bullshit, and he's insufferable about it the whole time. And the second game takes place, Soul Reaver, takes place thousands and thousands of years later. You see, at the end of Blood Omen, we're given a moral choice, and the good ending, Kain kills himself. But the bad ending is canon. So thousands and thousands of years in the future, Kain is now a vampire lord ruling over a ruined Earth, and that's really where the story starts going. That's game number 2. And then you get into all kinds of shit from there. I love them. There are parts of those games which hold up extraordinarily well. There are parts of those games that do not. But I love them, and I would love to share them with y'all. Okay, it sounds like we're kind of getting a pretty positive on that. So yeah, we'll start out with Blood Omen on Wednesday. I need to, I think I have them all on Steam. I just need to download them and make super sure that they work. If nothing else, we can emulate Blood Omen. So it's a PS1 game. Strangely enough, it does play completely differently from all the others. The others are sort of like 3D action-y, sort of. Although the very last one is very much like, wow, you can tell this was made after, like, Devil May Cry was popular. But Blood Omen 1 is like Zelda top-down style with dungeons. Yeah, it's weird, but it's a good weird. And you're gonna hate Cain, but also love him. He literally, there's also, like, there's a little thing in the top right, that, like, your little blood meter, that's your health, and well, every time you swing your sword, it lights up, and after it lights up enough, then Cain laughs. He goes, and that's not really a mechanic, but it is a thing that happens constantly. So he starts laughing if you swing your sword a bunch. Or he says, Ve Victus, which means suffering to the conquered, in case you forget. And every time someone says it in the story, they will remind you that Ve Victus means suffering to the conquered. Okay, well, I'm now excited about streaming Legacy of Kain, so that's going to be hype. Fridays we'll keep doing, yeah, it's great. And then it gets obscenely good. And then by the end of it, you're gonna think, oh, this is so goofy, and I'm so fucking angry that there will never be an ending. You're gonna be so mad. It's good. Also, well, this is also, if you're familiar with, mostly the early Uncharted games, although I think she had a hand in the later ones, Amy Hennig. She did most of the writing for, I believe she also worked on Blood Omen, but she was in charge of all of the others. So, fantastic writer. I think that's all I have to say, and now I'm just gushing. But yeah, on Friday we'll pick back up on some kind of game from the bundle for Racial Justice. I'm having a lot of fun showing those off. We ended up playing the Bunnies game, and that's great. I love that game a lot. I need to get up the VODs for both of them on YouTube. Because unfortunately, Tony missed both streams. And I gotta get the bunny content for Tony. It's gotta be available. But I've kind of sat over here and rambled for a good while, so I'm gonna sign off. And I'll catch all y'all later. Actually, I might hop in on Discord if y'all are still on there. I'll probably be on Final Fantasy or whatever, I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, thank all of y'all for showing up. It's been a lot of fun. Good night, y'all.